Section 17 of Heroes Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daniel J. Johnson. Heroes Every Child Should Know. Edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie. Section 17. St. Louis. Adapted from The Crusaders by A.J. Church. King Louis, sailing from Cyprus about the 24th day of May, 1249, came with a fair wind to Egypt in some 4 days, having a great fleet of ships, numbering in all, it was said, some 1800, great and small. And now there fell upon him the first stroke of misfortune. There arose a strong wind from the south, which scattered the fleet, so that not more than a third part remained with the king. As for the others, they were blown far to the north, even to the town of Acre, and though none were cast away, it was many days before they could return. Now the king's purpose was to lay siege to the town of Damietta, a town which is built on the midmost of the 7 mouths of the Nile. It was commonly agreed that whoever should hold possession of this said town of Damietta might go whithersoever he would in the whole land of Egypt, and further, that whosoever should be master of Egypt could do what he would in the land of Palestine. When the king came with what was left to him over against the city of Damietta, there was much debate between him and his counselors as to what might best be done. I have no mind, said he, to turn back, having by the grace of God come so far. Say you that I should do well to wait for those who have been separated from us? That I would gladly do, for it grieves me much that they lose so far their share in this great enterprise. But 2 reasons constrain me to do otherwise. First, it would put the infidel in great heart if they should see me so delay to make trial of them. And second, there is here no harbor or safe anchorage where I might wait. Nay, my lords, it is my purpose to attack the enemy without delay, for the Lord our God can save by few or by many. The king, being thus steadfastly resolved to have no more delay, his nobles and knights could not choose but obey him. This being so, they strove among themselves who should be the first to come to blows with the enemy. There were small boats with the larger of the ships, and these were filled with men and rowed to the shore. This was not done wholly without loss, for some slipped as they descended from the ships, or missed their feet, the boat moving from under them with the motion of the waves, so that some were drowned, and others hardly saved. Meanwhile they took the great flag of Saint Denis from the ship in which it was, and carried it to the shore. But when the king saw the flag on the shore, he would tarry no longer, but leaped into the sea, accoutred as he was, and the water came up to his armpits. When he saw the Saracens, he said to the knight that followed him, Who are these? And the knight answered, These, sir, are the Saracens. When he heard this, he put his lance in rest, and held his shield before him, and would have charged them, but his counselors would not suffer it. When the enemy saw that the king and his men had landed, they sent a message to the Sultan by carrier pigeons. This they did 3 times. But it so chanced that the Sultan was in a fit of the fever which troubled him in the summer time, and he sent no answer. Then his men, thinking that he was dead, for they knew already that he was sick, fled straight away from the town of Damietta. When the king knew this for certain, the bishops that were in the army sang the Te Deum with great joy. The army which King Louis brought with him numbered 30,000 men. The army being thus established in the town of Damietta, there was much debate as to what should be done. The king was set upon assailing the enemy without delay. It is by delay, he said, and said truly, that these enterprises have been ruined heretofore, for not only does an army grow less and less with every day by sickness, keep it as carefully as you will, such loss must needs happen, but the first fire of zeal begins to burn low. To such purpose the king spoke to his counselors, nor could they gainsay his words. Yet they had to urge on the other part reasons so weighty that they could not be resisted. The truth is that there could not have been chosen a worse time for the waging of war in Egypt than that at which the king arrived. Whereas other rivers overflow their banks in the winter season, the Nile overflows his in summer. And this he does because his stream is swollen, not by rains that fall in the land of Egypt, for such rains are more scanty than in any other country of the world, but by those that fall in countries far inland, and haply by the melting of snows. So it is that in that part of Egypt which is nearest to the sea, the river begins to rise in the month of June, and for a quarter of a year or so thereafter an army must rest perforce. The king was very ill served in his ministers when he was suffered to remain in ignorance of these things. Nevertheless, the case being so, he had no choice but to accept the counsel of delay. It was agreed, therefore, that the army should tarry in Damietta till the floods of the river should have ceased. In the beginning of the month of December the king set out for Cairo with his army. Now the Sultan had sent 500 of his knights, the bravest warriors and the best mounted that he could find in his whole army, to the end that they should harass the king's army as much as might be. Now the king, being very careful of the lives of his men, as knowing that a soldier lost could not be replaced, had given a strict commandment that no one should presume to leave the line of march and charge the enemy. When the Turks saw this, or haply had learnt from their spies that the king had given this commandment, they grew bolder and bolder, till one of them, riding up to the line, overthrew one of the Knights Templar. This was done under the very eyes of the master of the temple, who, when he saw it, could no longer endure to be quiet. So he cried to his brethren, "At them, good sirs, for this is more than can be borne." So he spurred his horse, and the other Templars with him, and charged the Turks. And because their horses were fresh, and the horses of the Turks weary, they bore them down. It was said that not one of the 500 escaped, many being ridden down, and the rest being drowned in the river. After this the king encamped between the two branches of the Nile, that which flows by Damietta, and that which is next to it toward the sun setting. On the other side of this branch was ranged the army of the Sultan, to hinder the Christians from passing, an easy thing, seeing that there was no ford, nor any place where a man might cross, save by swimming. While they were in this strait, there came a Bedouin to the camp, who said that for 500 pieces of gold he would show them a good ford. When the constable Elbridge, to whom the Bedouin had spoken of this ford, told the matter to the king said, "I will give the gold right willingly. Only be sure that the man perform his part of the bargain." So the constable parleyed with the man, but the Bedouin would not depart from his purpose. "Give me the gold," said he, "and I will show you the ford." And because the king was in a strait, he consented. So the man received the 500 pieces, and he showed the ford to certain that were sent with him. It was agreed that the Duke of Burgundy and other nobles who were not of France should keep guard in the camp, and that the king with his brothers should ford the river at the place which the Arabs should show. So, all being ready, at daybreak they came down to the water. A ford there was, but not such as a man would choose, save in the greatest need. The king, having with him the main body of the army, crossed amidst a great sounding of horns and trumpets. It was a noble sight to see, and nothing in it nobler and more admirable than the king himself. A fairer knight there never was, and he stood with a gilded helmet on his head, and a long German sword in his hand, being by his head and shoulders taller than the crowd. Then he and his knights charged the Saracens, who by this time had taken a stand again on the river bank. It was a great feat of arms. No man drew longbow that day, or plied crossbow. The Crusaders and the Saracens fought with mace and sword, neither keeping their ranks, but all being confused together. But the Crusaders, for all their valor, could scarce hold their own, because the enemy outnumbered them by much. Also there was a division of counsel among them. Also there came a messenger from them that was shut up in Mansura, telling the king how hard pressed they were, and in what instant need of succor. And now the Saracens grew more and more confident, for they were greatly the better in numbers, and if man for man, and in the matter of arms and armor, they were scarce equal to the Crusaders, yet the difference was not so great. They pushed on, therefore, and drove the Crusaders back to the river. These were very hard pressed, and some were for swimming across the river to the camp. But by this time their horses were weary, and not a few perished by drowning. Nevertheless, as time passed, the Crusaders fared somewhat better, for they drew more together, and the enemy, seeing that they still held their ground, and being themselves not a little weary, drew back. In the end, the king and such of the chiefs as were left got back into the camp. Right glad they were to rest, for the battle had been long and fierce, but they had little peace. For that very night the Saracens made an attack upon the camp. A great disturbance they made, and most unwelcome to men who had been fighting all the day. But they did not work much harm. Many valiant deeds were done by the Christians. But the Saracens were making ready for attacking the camp with more force than before, and their leader could be seen from the camp, taking account of the Crusaders and strengthening his battalions where he thought that the king's camp might be most conveniently assailed. The first attack was made on the Count of Anjou. He held that part of the camp that was nearest to the city of Cairo. Some of the enemy were on horseback, and some on foot. There were some also that threw Greek fire among the Count's men. Between them they pressed the Count so sorely that he was fain to send to the king for help. This the king gave without loss of time. He led the men himself, and it was not long before they chased the Saracens from this part of the field. When the battle was over, the king called the barons to his tent, and thanked them for all they had done, and gave them great encouragement, saying that as they had driven back the Saracens over and again, it would, beyond doubt, go well with them in the end. And now the army was sore distressed for want both of food and of water. In Damietta, indeed, there were yet stores of barley, rice, and other grains, but in the camp scarce anything that could be eaten. Some small fishes were caught in the river, but these were very ill-savored, and all the more so at least it seemed to such as eat them under constraint of hunger, because they fed on dead bodies, of which many were thrown into the river. For a while some portion of the stores that were in the city were carried across the river to the camp, but this the Saracens hindered, for by this time their ships had the mastery over the ships of the Christians. They kept therefore the river, suffering nothing to pass. If anything was carried across, it was but a trifle. Some things the country people brought into the camp, but these were not to be purchased save for large sums of money, and money by this time was scarce even among the richer sort. And when it was judged expedient that the king's army should cross the river again and return to the camp, things were worse rather than better, so far as victuals were concerned. It was well that the army should be brought together, both for attack and for defense, but with the greater multitude, the famine grew worse and worse. After a while there was a treating for peace between the king and the Saracens, and for a while it seemed as if they might come to an agreement, and this not without advantage to the king. But the matter came to naught, because the Saracens would have the king himself as a hostage for the due performance of the treaty. The Christians would have given the king's brothers, and these were willing to go, but the king they could not give. "It would be better," said one of the bravest knights in the army, and in this matter he spake the mind of all, "that we should all be taken captive or slain than that we should leave the king in pledge." The king, seeing that the condition of the army still grew from bad to worse, and that if they tarried they would all be dead men, commanded that they should make their way into the town of Damietta. And this the army began to do the very next night. Now the first thing to be cared for was the taking of the sick, of whom there was a great multitude on board the ships. But while this was being done, the Saracens entered the camp on the other side. When the sailors who were busy in embarking the sick saw this, they tossed the cables by which they were moored to the shore, and made as if they would fly. Now the king was on the bank of the river, and there was a galley in waiting for him, whereon, if he had been so minded, he might easily have escaped. Nor could he have been blamed therefore, because he was afflicted with the dysentery that prevailed in the camp. But this he would not do. Nay, he said, I will stay with my people. But when there was now no hope of safety, one of his officers took him, mounted as he was on a pony, to a village hard by, defending him all the way from such as chanced to fall in with him. But none knew that he was the king. When he was come to the village, they took him into a house that there was, and laid him down almost dead. A good woman of Paris that was there took his head upon her lap, and there was no one but thought that he would die before nightfall. Then one of the nobles, coming in, asked the king whether he should not go to the chief of the Saracens and see whether a treaty might not yet be made on such terms as they would. The king said yes. So he went. Now there was a company of the Saracens round the house, whither by this time not a few of the Christians had assembled. And one of the king's officers cried, whether from fear or with traitorous intent cannot be said, Sir knights, surrender yourselves. The king will have it so. If you do not, the king will perish. So the knights gave up their swords, and the Saracens took them as prisoners. When the chief of the Saracens, with whom the noble aforesaid was talking, saw them, he said, There can be no talk of truce and agreement with these men. They are prisoners. And now the question was not of a treaty, but a ransom. About this there was no little debate between the Sultan and the king. First, the Sultan required that the king should surrender to him the castles of the Knights Templars and of the Hospitallers of St. John. Nay, said the king, that I cannot do, for they are not mine to give. This answer greatly provoked the Sultan, and he threatened to put the king to the torture, to which the king answered this only, that he was a prisoner in their hands, and that they could do with him as they would. When they saw that they could not turn him from his purpose by threats or by fear, they asked him how much money he was willing to pay to the Sultan for his ransom, such money being over and above the rendering up of the town of Damietta. Then the king made answer, If the Sultan will take a reasonable sum in money for ransom, I will recommend it to the queen that she should pay the same. Nay, said the envoy of the Sultan, why do you not say outright that you will have it so? Because, answered the king, in this matter it is for the queen to say yea or nay. I am a prisoner, and my royal power is gone from me. So it was agreed that if the queen would pay 1,000 gold pieces by way of ransom, the king should go free. Said the king, Will the Sultan swear to this bargain? They said that he would. So it was agreed that the king should pay for the ransom of his army 1,000 gold pieces, and for his own ransom the town of Damietta. For, said he, a king cannot be bought and sold for money. When the Sultan heard this, he said, On my word, this is a noble thing of the Frenchman that he makes no bargaining concerning so great a thing. Tell him that I give him as a free gift the 5th part of the sum which he has covenanted to pay. All things were now settled, and there were but 4 days before the fulfilling of the treaty, when the king should give up Damietta to the Sultan, and the Sultan, on his part, should suffer the king and his people to go free. But lo, there came to pass that which was like to bring the whole matter to nothing. The emirs of the Sultan made a conspiracy against him. Know this, they said to one another, that so soon as he shall find himself master of Damietta, he will slay us. Let us therefore be beforehand with him. And it was agreed that this should be done. First, when the Sultan was going to his chamber after a banquet which he had given to the emirs, One, who was indeed his sword-bearer, dealt him a blow and struck off his hand. But the Sultan, being young and nimble, escaped into a strong tower that was hard by his chamber, and 3 of his priests were with him. The emirs called upon him to give himself up. "That," said he, "I will do, if you will give me a promise of my life." "Nay," they answered, "we will give you no promises. If you surrender not of your own free will, then will we compel you." Then they threw Greek fire at the tower, and the tower, which was built of pine wood, caught fire on the instant. When the Sultan saw this, he ran down with all the speed that he could, seeking to reach the river, if so be he could find a ship. But the emirs and their men were ranged along the way, nor was it long before they slew him. And he that dealt him the last blow came to the king, his hand yet dripping with blood, and said, "What will you give me? I have slain your enemy, who would assuredly have done you to death had he lived." But the king answered him not a word. Now the covenant between the king and the Saracen chiefs was renewed, nor was any change made in the conditions. Only the payment was differently ordered. That is to say, 1/2 of the ransom was to be paid before the king left the place where he was, and the other half in the town of Acre. Then the emirs on the one part, and the king on the other, took the oaths that were held to be the most binding on them. The king indeed held staunchly by his faith, and when the emirs would have had him swear in a way that he thought to be unseemly to him as a Christian man, he would not. And the emirs paid him the more honor and reverence for this very cause. It was said, indeed, that they would have made him Sultan of Cairo if he had been minded to receive that dignity at their hands. Furthermore, some that knew the king affirmed that he was not altogether set against it. But none knew for certain the truth in the matter. Yet it was well said by one of the emirs, "There surely never was a better or more steadfast Christian than this King Louis. Verily, if he had been made our Sultan, he would never have been content till he had either made us all Christians, or failing this, had put us all to the sword." And now there came a time of great peril to the prisoners. First, the town of Damietta was given up to the Saracens, the gates being opened, and their flag hoisted on the towers. On the next day the paying of the ransom was begun. When the money was counted, it was found to be short by some 30,000 pieces. These were taken from the treasury of the Templars, much against their will, but the necessities of the prisoners prevailed. As for the king, there could not have been a man more loyal in the fulfilling of his promise. When one of those that counted the money said that the Saracens had received less than their due by some 10,000 pieces, the king would not suffer but that the whole matter should be looked into, lest the Saracens should have wrong. The counter, indeed, averred that this thing was said in jest, but the king answered that such a jest was out of season, and that above all things it was necessary that a Christian should show good faith. Not many days after the paying of the ransom, the king sent for his chief counselors, and opened his mind to them in the matter of his return to France. He said, "The queen, my mother, begs me to come back to France, saying that my kingdom is in great peril, seeing that I have no peace, nor even a truce with England. Tell me then what you think, and because it is a great matter, I give you 8 days to consider it." After this the king went to Acre, where he tarried till what was left over of the ransom was paid. On the day appointed, the counselors came before the king, who said to them, "What do you advise? Shall I go, or shall I stay?" They said that they had chosen one from among them, a certain Guy Malvoisin, to speak for them. Thereupon this Guy said, "These lords have taken counsel together, and are agreed that you cannot tarry in this country without damage to yourself and your kingdom. For think how that of all the knights whom you had in Cyprus, 2,800 in number, there remain with you here in Acre scarce 100. Our counsel, therefore, is that you return to France, and there gather another army, with which you may come hither again, and take vengeance on your enemies for their trespasses against God and against you. Then the king turned to a certain John, who was Count of Jaffa, and asked him for his judgment. Count John answered, Ask me not, sire, my domain is here, and if I bid you stay, then it will be said that I did this for my own profit. But when the king was urgent for his advice, he said, If you stay for a year, it will be for your honor. And one other of the councillors gave the same judgment. But all the rest were urgent for the king's return. Then the king said, I will tell you 8 days hence what it is my pleasure to do. On the day appointed they all came together again, and the king said, I thank you, my lords, for your counsel, both those who have advised my going back, and those who have advised my staying. Now, I hold that if I stay, my kingdom of France will be in no peril, seeing that the queen my mother is well able to keep it in charge, but that if I depart, then the kingdom of Jerusalem will most certainly be lost, because no man will be bold enough to stay after I am gone. Now it was for the sake of this same kingdom of Jerusalem that I have come hither. My purpose, therefore, is to stay. There was no little trouble among the barons when they heard these words. There were some among them who could not hold back their tears. But though the king resolved himself to stay, yet he commanded his brothers to depart. And this they did before many days. While the king tarried at Acre, there came to him messengers from the old man of the mountain. One of the messengers was the spokesman, and had his place in front. The second had in his hand 3 daggers, to signify what danger threatened him who should not listen to the message. The third carried a shroud of buckram for him who should be smitten with the daggers. Then the king said to the first envoy, Speak on. Then the envoy said, My master says, Know you me? The king answered, I know him not, for I have never seen him, yet I have often heard others talk of him. Why then, went on the envoy, have you not sent him such gifts as would have gained his friendship, even as the Emperor of Germany and the King of Hungary and other princes have done, yea, and do now, year after year, knowing well that they cannot live save by my lord's pleasure? The king made no answer, but bade the envoys come again in the afternoon. When they came, they found the king sitting with the master of the Templars on one side, and the master of the Hospitallers on the other. Now the old man is in great awe of these two, for he knows that if he slay them, there will be put in their place other 2 as good or better. The envoys were not a little disturbed when they saw the 2. And the master of the Templars said, Your lord is overbold to send you with such a message for the king. Now be sure that we would have drowned you in the sea, but that so doing might be a wrong to him. Go now to your lord, and come back again in 14 days, with such a token and such gifts as may suffice for the making of peace. So the envoys departed, and came again in the time appointed. And they brought with them the shirt of the old man and his ring, which was of the finest gold, and with these things this message. As man wears no garment that is nearer to him than his shirt, so the old man will have the king nearer to him than any other king upon earth. And as a ring is the sign of marriage by which 2 are made one, so the old man would have himself and the king to be one. Other gifts there were, an elephant of crystal very cunningly wrought, and a monster which they call a giraffe, also of crystal, and draughts and chessmen all finely made. The king on his part sent to the old man a great store of jewels and scarlet cloth, and dishes of gold, and bridles of silver. While the king was at Jaffa, it was told him that if he desired to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the Sultan of Damascus would give him a safe conduct. The king consulted his nobles on the matter, and both he and they were of one mind in the matter, to wit, that he should not go. For they said, If the king should go as a pilgrim when he has not been able to take the holy city itself out of the hands of the infidel, then will other kings in time come to do the same. They will be content to go as pilgrims, but will take no thought as to the city, whether it be held by Christian or infidel. After these things the king went to the city of Sidon, and fortified it with strong walls, for he was greatly unwilling to give up his hope of winning the whole land out of the hands of the infidel. But when he had brought this work to an end, there came news to him from his own country that the queen his mother, who was charged with the government thereof, was dead. Then he took counsel with his nobles what he should do, and it seemed to them that he must of necessity return to France. One among them put the case before the king as follows: Sire, we see that it will not profit the kingdom of Jerusalem that you tarry longer here. You have done what was in your power. You have fortified the city of Sidon and Caesarea and Jaffa, and you have made the city of Acre much stronger than it was. And now for your own kingdom's sake you must needs depart. And to this the king gave his consent, though with an unwilling heart. So he departed, and this, as it chanced, on his birthday. As the ship went forth from the harbour, he said to the lord of Joinville, who stood by him, On this day I was born. And the lord of Joinville said to him, Truly, sire, I should say that you are beginning another life, now that you are safely quit of this land of death. Some 17 years after these things last recorded, I took a journey to the island of Sardinia, and made my abode at a town on the west coast called Neapolis. When I had sojourned there 2 months, there came in sight on a certain day a great fleet of ships, which those who were acquainted with such things declared to be from the land of France. As for the crowd that came ashore that day, it were best to say little. It is more to the purpose to say that I met with one whom I knew, having consorted with him in the past, and this the more constantly because he followed the same occupation as I. I asked him, How came you hither? If you are bound for Palestine, this is but a short stage in your journey. He answered me with something of a smile in his eye, though his mouth was set. Where could we more conveniently halt than here? For we are bound for Tunis. For Tunis, said I, but how shall this help you for the taking of Jerusalem? That, said he, you must ask of some one that has more wisdom than I. But this I know, that the king was told, by whom I know not, that the Bey of Tunis desired to be baptized. This then is cause sufficient for him. Are you minded to come with me? If so, I can find you a place in the king's ship, for it is in it that I sail. When I heard that, I consented without delay. So that night I gave my friend the shelter of my lodging, and the next day he took me with him, and commended me to one of the chief officers of the ship, bearing witness to my skill as a physician. On the 4th day we sailed, and came in 2 days, the wind blowing from the north, to the harbour of Tunis. As for the king, I saw him but once, and his valets carried him up on the deck, and to tell the truth, he looked as little fit for doing feats of arms as a man could look. But I thought that the sickness which takes many men upon the sea might be the cause. Scarce had the army landed than there began a most grievous sickness. In truth, the place for the camp had been ill chosen, for there was a little stream into which much of the filth of the city was wont to run. From this there came a most evil smell. Many also, for want of good water, would drink of the stream, than which there could be no more deadly thing. On the very day after he landed from his ship, the king fell sick. His physician being disabled by the same malady, I was called into the king's help, and from the first I saw that save by a miracle he could not live. On the 4th day he died, making as good and devout an end as any that I have ever seen. He would know the truth, for he was not one of those who buoy themselves up with false hopes. And when he knew it, then first with the help of the priests that attended him he prepared his soul, and afterward he gave what time remained to teaching the son who should be king after him, how he should best do his duty to God and man. I heard much from him who had put it in my mind to come from the island of Sardinia concerning King Louis. Never, he told me, was a king more bent on doing justice and judgment. These he maintained with his whole heart and strength, not having any respect of persons or having any regard to his own profit. Though he held bishops and priests in great reverence, being most careful of all the offices of religion, Yet he would withstand even these when they seemed to seek that which was not fair and just. He was a lover of peace, far beyond the want of kings, who indeed for the most part care but little for it, so that men say in a proverb, "War is the game of kings." Of the poor he was a great and constant favourer. Every day he had a multitude of them fed at his cost in his palace, and sometimes he would serve himself, and it was his custom on a certain day to wash the feet of poor men. In his eating and drinking he was as temperate as any man could be, drinking, for example, but 1 cup of wine, and that largely mingled with water. In all things wherein great men ofttimes offend, he was wholly blameless and beyond reproach. Of all men that I had any knowledge of, whether by sight or by hearing, in this business of the Crusades, there was not one who could be so much as named in comparison with King Louis. To King Louis, religion was as life itself. It filled, as it were, his whole soul. He judged of all things by it. He hungered and thirsted after it. And yet of all who bore the cross, this man, being as he was, so much the most faithful to his vow, by far the truest cross-bearer of all, yet failed the most utterly. Of such things I have not the wit to judge, yet this methinks is manifest, that the kingdom of God is not set forward by the power of armies. I do believe that if King Louis, being what he was, a man after God's own heart, had come not with the sword, but preaching the truth by his life, he had done more for the cause that he had at heart. As it was, he furthered it not at all, so as far as I can discern, but rather set it back. That he did not gain for Christendom so much as a single foot of earth is not so much to be lamented, as that he made wider the breach between Christian men and the followers of Mahomet. And this he did, though he was in very truth the most Christ-like of all the men that I have ever seen. End of section 17. Recording by Daniel J. Johnson.
Section 18 of Heroes Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Heroes Every Child Should Know, edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie. Section 18. William Tell. Adapted from Stories from History by Agnes Strickland. William Tell was born toward the close of the 13th century. I cannot tell you the precise year of his birth, but in the year 1307 he was a married man, and lived with his wife and children in the village of Burglen, near the great town of Altdorf, in the canton of Uri. Tell maintained his family chiefly by hunting the chamois and shooting other wild game. So skillful was he in the use of the bow, that the fame of his exploits in that way had obtained for him the name of the crossbow-man of Burglen. He was also very skillful in the management of boats upon the lakes. His father had followed the profession of a pilot, and William Tell, though he preferred the life of a hunter, understood the navigation of the lakes better than almost any boatman in the canton of Uri. It was a saying, that William Tell knew how to handle the rudder as expertly as the bow. In short, he was a person of strong natural talents, who observed on everything he saw, and acquired all the knowledge he could. Switzerland was at that time in a state of slavery to Albert, Duke of Austria, who had recently been selected Emperor of Germany. He had taken great offense with the Swiss, because they wished Count Adolf of Nassau to be elected Emperor of Germany instead of him. The first use he made of his power was to punish the Swiss for having favored the cause of his rival, and he was so unwise as to declare publicly that he would no longer treat them as subjects, but as slaves. In pursuance of this wicked resolution, he deprived them of many of their rights and privileges, and altered their ancient laws and customs. By these proceedings, the Emperor rendered his government very unpopular, and when he found that the people expressed dissatisfaction, he built castles and fortresses all over the country, and filled them with soldiers to awe the people into submission. In each of these fortresses he placed a governor, who exercised despotic power in the district over which his sway extended. The inhabitants of the canton of Uri, in particular, had to complain of the oppression of their German governor, Gessler, who had committed several murders, and acted in such a manner as to excite general indignation by his pride, cruelty, and injustice. The whole country was indeed ripe for a revolt, in case an opportunity should occur of throwing off the German yoke. One cold autumnal evening, the blaze of the cheerful fire which the wife of William Tell had kindled on the hearth, against her husband's return, gleamed through the rude lattice casements of their cottage window. The earthen floor of the humble dwelling had been freshly swept. A clean cloth of the matron's own spinning was spread on the homely board, which was garnished with wooden bowls and spoons of the most snowy whiteness, and a kettle of fish soup, with herbs, was stewing over the fire. Some flat oaten cakes, designed to be eaten hot with butter, were baking on the hearth. The babe was sleeping peacefully in the cradle. 2 or 3 of the little ones, weary with their sportive play, had been laid in their cribs. Henrik and Louis, 2 lovely boys of 5 and 6 years old, having promised to be very good, if allowed to sit up till their father's return, were watching their mother, who was employed in roasting a fine fat quail which their cousin, Lalotte, who had arrived at the discreet age of 14, was basting, and spinning the string by which it was suspended before the fire. "Mother," said Henrik, "if my father does not come home very soon, that quail will be done too much." "What then?" asked Lalotte. "I was thinking, Cousin Lalotte, that it would be a pity for it to be spoiled, after you and mother have taken so much pains in cooking it, and it smells so very good." "Oh, fie, you greedy child! You want to eat the bird that is cooking for your father's supper," said Lalotte. "If I were my aunt, I would send you to bed only for thinking of such a thing." "You are not the mistress, you are not the mistress," cried the sturdy rebel Henrik, "and I shall not go to bed at your desire." "But you shall go to bed, young sir, if your cousin Lalotte tells you to do so," said his father, who had entered during the dispute. "Alack!" cried Henrik, turning to his little brother, "if we had only been patient, Louis, we should have tasted the nice quail, and heard all our father's news into the bargain." "There now, see what you have lost by being naughty children," cried Lalotte, as she led the offenders into their little bedroom. "Thy father's news is not for thy young ears, my boys," murmured William Tell, as the door closed after the unconscious children. "There is a sadness in thy voice and trouble on thy brow," said the anxious wife of Tell, looking earnestly in his face. "Wilt thou not trust me with the cause of thy care?" "Annette," replied Tell, "thou hast been a good and faithful wife to me, yea, and a prudent counsellor and friend in the time of need. Why, then, should I do a thing and conceal it from thee, my well-beloved? What is it thou hast done, my husband?" "That for which thou wilt blame me, perchance." "Nay, say not so. Thou art a good man." "Thou knowest, my loving wife, the sad state of slavery to which this unhappy country of Switzerland is reduced by the unlawful oppression of our foreign rulers," said Tell. "I do," she replied, "but what have peasants to do with matters so much above them?" "Much," returned Tell. "If the good laws made by the worthies of the olden time, for the comfort and protection of all ranks of people, be set at naught by strangers, and all the ancient institutions, which were the pride and glory of our land, be overthrown, by those to whom we owe neither the love of children, nor the allegiance of subjects, then, methinks, good wife, it becomes the duty of peasants to stand forth in defense of their rights. I have engaged myself, with 33 of my valiant countrymen, who met this night on the little promontory of land that juts into a lonely angle of the lake, to concert with them means for the deliverance of my country." "But how can 33 men hope to oppose the power of those who enthrall Switzerland?" asked the wife of Tell. "Great objects are often effected by small instruments," replied he. "The whole population of Switzerland is exasperated against the German tyrants, who have of late abused their power so far as to rouse the indignation even of women and of children against them. The father of Arnold Melchthal, one of the brothers of Rutli, as our band is called, was recently put to a cruel death by the unjust sentence of Gessler, the governor of our own canton of Uri, and who knoweth, gentle wife, whether his jealous caprice may not induce him to single me out for his next victim?" "Single thee out, my husband!" exclaimed Annette, turning pale. "Nay, what accusation could he bring against thee?" "That of being the friend of my country, which is, of course, a crime not to be forgiven by a person of Gessler's disposition." "But Gessler is too much exalted above our humble sphere of life to be aware of a peasant's sentiments on such matters," said Annette. "Gessler will not permit us to indulge the thoughts of our hearts in secret," said Tell, "for he hath recently devised a shrewd test, whereby he is enabled to discern the freeman from the slave throughout this province." "And what is the test which the governor of Uri employeth for that purpose?" "Thou hast heard our good pastor read in the scripture of the prophet Daniel, of the golden image which the tyrant Nebuchadnezzar caused to be erected. He made a decree that all nations and people of the world should bow down and worship it, and that those who refused to do so should be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Rememberest thou this, my beloved?" Certainly, Annette replied. But what hath Gessler to do with that presumptuous folly of the king of Babylon? Gessler, replied Tell, imitates the presumption, albeit it is not in his power to rival the grandeur of Nebuchadnezzar. For he hath set up an idol in the marketplace of Outdoor, to which he requireth blind homage to be paid by fools and cowards. Now, the king of Babylon's idol, the prophet tells us, was of solid gold, a metal which the world is, I grieve to say, too prone to worship. But Gessler's paltry Baal is but the empty ducal bonnet of Austria, which he hath exalted on a pole, and he commands the men of Uri to bow down before it under penalty of death. Wouldst thou wish thy husband to degrade the name of a Swiss by stooping to such an action? No, she replied, I should blush for thee, if thou wert capable of such baseness. Thou hast spoken like a free woman, he exclaimed. Yea, and thou shalt be the mother of free children. For the first time I go to Altdorf, I will resist the edict, which enjoins me and my countrymen to pay homage to the senseless bauble which the German governor hath exalted in the marketplace. But why go to Altdorf at all, my husband? Said the wife of Tell. My business calls me to Altdorf, and I shall go thither like an honest man, in the performance of my duty, replied Tell. Thinkest thou that I am either to confess myself a slave, by bending my body to an empty cat, or to permit it to be a scarecrow, that shall fright me from entering the capital city of my native province, lest I should draw upon myself the penalty of refusing to perform a contemptible action, enjoined by a wicked man? No, no, my sweet wife, I shall go to Altdorf, when occasion may require, without considering myself bound to observe Gessler's foolish edict. The return of Lalotte put an end to this discourse, and Annette began to assist her in taking up the supper. Lalotte was the orphan of Tell's brother. Her parents had both died when she and her brother Philip were very young, and they had been adopted into the family of her kind uncle soon after his marriage with Annette. Lalotte was affectionate, sprightly, and industrious. She assisted her aunt in the household work in the dairy, and it was her business to take charge of the children, whom she carefully instructed in such things as she knew, and labored to render them virtuous and obedient. Philip, her brother, who was about a year older than herself, had been unfortunately a spoiled child. He was self-willed and intractable, and, though far from a bad disposition, was always getting himself and others into scrapes and difficulties. That night his place at the board was vacant, which his uncle observing said, Lalotte, where is your brother Philip? Absent, uncle, I'm sorry to say, replied Lalotte. It is not usual for Philip to desert the supper meal, observed Tell, even if he be absent the rest of the day. I am afraid he is after no good. A hasty step was heard, and Lalotte exclaimed, I should not wonder if that were my scapegrace brother. It does not sound well of you to call him so, Lalotte, though he is a sad plague to us all, said Tell. The door was hastily opened, and Philip bounced in out of breath and covered with mud. He flung himself on the wooden settle beside the fire, and gave way to fits of laughter. How now, Philip, what is the cause of all this? asked Tell gravely. Hooray! shouted he, springing from his seat and capering about. I have done such a deed. Some notable piece of folly, no doubt, observed his uncle. What is it, boy? A deed that will render my name famous throughout the whole province of Uri, my good uncle. Everybody is talking about it in Altdorf at this very moment, exclaimed Philip, rubbing his hands. You have long been celebrated there as the ringleader of mischief, observed Tell, but I doubt whether you will have much reason to exult in the evil reputation you have acquired, Philip. Therefore go to bed, and when you say your prayers, ask for grace to reform your evil habits. My good uncle, replied Philip, be content. This night I have turned patriot, raised a rabble of boys, and pelted down the fool's cap which old Gessler had stuck up on the marketplace of Altdorf for Switzers to pay homage to. Is not that a glorious deed? It is a piece with the rest of your folly. Were you called upon to pay homage to the cat? By no means, uncle, else must I perforce have made my obeisance to the empty bonnet of the Emperor Duke of Austria. But this exploit of mine was after dark, when one boy could not be distinguished from another, and there were fully 50 of us engaged in pelting at the mock majesty till down it came, feathers and all, souse into the mud. Then, oh stars, how we all ran! But it was my stone that hit it, take notice. Ha, ha, ha! Your head must be as devoid of brains as the empty cap you pelted, Philip, or you never would have engaged in any such adventure. How, uncle? cried Philip in amazement. Would you have me pay homage to the ducal bonnet without a head in it? It seems you were not required to do so, Philip. Therefore you had no pretext for raising a riot to break the peace. But, uncle, do you intend to yield obedience to the governor's tyrannous edict? Philip, replied Tell, I am a man, and of age to form a correct judgment of things which it may be expedient to do or proper to refuse. But it is not meet for idle boys to breed riots and commit acts of open violence, calculated to plunge a whole country into confusion. Philip withdrew with an air of great mortification, and the family soon after retired to rest. The next day William Tell took his thoughtless nephew with him on a hunting excursion, since it was necessary he should find some better occupation than throwing stones. After several days they returned, loaded with the skins of the chamois that had been slain by the unerring arrow of Tell. His wife and children hastened to the cottage door to welcome him, when they beheld him coming. "Behold, my beloved," said Tell, "how well I have sped in the chase. These skins will bring in a mine of wealth against the winter season. Tomorrow is Outdoor Fair, and I shall go thither to sell them." "Hurrah!" shouted Philip. "Is Outdoor Fair tomorrow? Oh, my faith, I had forgotten it. Well, I shall go thither and have some fun." "And I mean to go too, Cousin Philip," said Henrik. "Not so fast, young men," cried Tell. "Outdoor Fair will be full of soldiers and turbulent people, and is not a proper place for rash boys and children." "But you will take care of us, father, dear father," said Henrik, stroking his father's arm caressingly. "I shall have enough to do to take care of myself, Henrik," replied Tell, "so you must be a good boy and stay with your mother." "But I won't be a good boy if you leave me at home," muttered the little rebel. "Then you must be whipped, sir," said his father, "for we love you too well to permit you to be naughty without punishing you." On hearing this, Henrik began to weep with anger, so his father told Lalotte to put him to bed without his supper. Now Philip was a silly, good-natured fellow, and fancied that his little cousin, Henrik, of whom he was very fond, was ill-treated by his father. So he took an opportunity of slipping a sweet cake into his pouch, from the supper board, with which he slyly stole to Henrik's crib. "Never mind my cross uncle, sweet cousin," said he. "See, I have brought you a nice cake." "Oh, I don't care about cakes," cried Henrik. "I want to go to Outdoor Fair tomorrow." "And you shall go to Outdoor Fair," said Philip. "But how can I go when father says he won't take me?" sobbed Henrik. "There, dry your eyes and go to sleep," whispered Philip. "As soon as my uncle is gone, I will take you to the fair with me, for I mean to go, in spite of all he has said to the contrary." "But what will mother say?" asked Henrik. "We won't let her know anything about it," said Philip. "But Lalotte won't let us go, for Lalotte is very cross and wants to master me." "A fig for Lalotte!" cried the rude Philip. "Do you think I care for her?" "I won't care for Lalotte when I grow a big boy like you, Cousin Philip, but she makes me mind her now," said Henrik. "Never fear, we shall find some way of outwitting Mademoiselle Lalotte tomorrow," said Philip. The next morning William Tell rose at an early hour and proceeded to the fair at Outdorf to sell his chamois skins. Philip, instead of getting up and offering to carry them for his uncle, lay in bed till after he was gone. He was pondering on his undutiful scheme of taking little Henrik to the fair, in defiance of Tell's express commands that both should stay at home that day. Henrik could eat no breakfast that morning for thinking of the project in which Philip had tempted him to engage. His kind mother patted his curly head, and gave him a piece of honeycomb for not crying to go to the fair. He blushed crimson red at this commendation, and was just going to tell his mother all about it, when Philip, guessing his thoughts, held up his finger and shook his head at him. When his mother and Lalotte went into the dairy to churn the butter, they begged Henrik and Philip to take care of Louis and the other little ones, so that they should not get into any mischief. No sooner, however, were they gone, than Philip said, "Now, Henrik, is our time to make our escape, and go to the fair." "But," said Henrik, "my mother gave me some sweet and honeycomb just now, for being a good boy, and it will be very naughty of me to disobey my father's commands after that. So, dear Philip, I was thinking that I would stay at home to-day, if you would stay too and make little boats for me to float on the lake." "I shall do no such thing, I promise you," replied Philip, "for I mean to go to the fair, and see the fun. You may stay at home, if you like, for I don't want to be plagued with your company." "Oh, dear," cried Henrik, "but I want very much to go to the fair and to see the fun too." "Come along then," said Philip, "or we shall not get there in time to see the tumblers, or the apes and dancing bears, or the fire eaters, or any other of the shows." It was nearly 2 hours before the Traunts were missed by Henrik's mother and Lalotte, for they were all that time busy in the dairy. At length they heard the children cry, on which Lalotte ran into the room, and found no one with them but Louis. "What a shame," cried Lalotte, "for that lazy boy Philip to leave all these little ones, with only you, Louis. Where is Henrik, pray?" "Oh, Henrik is gone to the fair with Cousin Philip," lisped little Louis. "Oh, that wicked Philip!" cried Lalotte. Aunt! Philip has run off to Outdoor Fair, and taken Henrik with him." "My dear Lalotte," said her aunt, "you must put on your hood and sabots, and run after them. Perhaps, as you are light-footed, you can overtake them, and bring Henrik back. I am sure some mischief will befall him." Lalotte hastily threw her gray serge cloak about her, and drew the hood over her head. She slipped her little feet into her sabots, or wooden shoes, and took the road to Outdorf, hurrying along as fast as she could, in hope of overtaking the Traunts before they reached the town. More than once the little maiden thought of turning back, but the remembrance of Philip's rash and inconsiderate temper filled her with alarm for the safety of the child whom he had tempted away from home. She reflected that, as her uncle was at Altdorf, it would be her wisest course to proceed thither to seek him out, and to inform him of his little boy being then in the fair. Lalotte entered the market-place of Altdorf at the moment when her uncle, having disposed of his chamois skins to advantage, was crossing from the carrier's stall to a clothier's booth to purchase woolen cloths for winter garments. Fairs were formerly marts, where merchants and artisans brought their goods for sale, and persons resorted thither, not for the purpose of riot and revelling, but to purchase useful commodities, clothing, and household goods at the best advantage. William Tell had been requested by his careful wife to purchase a variety of articles for the use of the family. He was so intent in performing all her biddings, to the best of his ability, that he never once thought of the cap which the insolent governor, Gessler, had erected in the market-place, till he found himself opposite to the lofty pole on which it was exalted. He would have passed it unconsciously had he not been stopped by the German soldiers, who were under arms on either side of the pole, to enforce obedience to the insulting edict of the governor of Uri. Tell then paused, and, raising his eyes to the object to which the captain of the guard, with an authoritative gesture, directed his attention, beheld the ducal cap of Austria just above him. The color mounted to the cheek of the free-born hunter of the Alps at the sight of this badge of slavery of his fallen country. Casting an indignant glance upon the foreign soldiers who had impeded his progress, he moved sternly forward, without offering the prescribed act of homage to the cap. "Stop!" cried the captain of the guard. "You are incurring the penalty of death, rash man, by your disobedience to the edict of his Excellency the Governor of Uri." "Indeed," replied Tell, "I was not aware that I was doing anything unlawful." "You have insulted the majesty of our lord the Emperor by passing that cap without bowing to it," said the officer. "I wist not that more respect were due to an empty cap than to a cloak and doublet, or a pair of hose," replied Tell. "Insolent traitor! Dost thou presume to level thy rude gibes at the badge of royalty?" cried the governor, stepping forward from behind the soldiers, where he had been listening to the dispute between Tell and the officer. Poor Lalotte, meantime, having caught a glimpse of her uncle's tall, manly figure through the crowd, had pressed near enough to hear the alarming dialogue in which he had been engaged with the German soldiers. While, pale with terror, she stood listening with breathless attention, she recognized Philip at no great distance, with little Henrik in his arms, among the spectators. The thoughtless Philip was evidently neither aware how near he was to his uncle, nor of the peril in which he stood. With foolish glee he was pointing out the cap to little Henrik, and though Lalotte could not hear what he was saying, she fancied that he was rashly boasting to the child of the share in the exploit of pelting it down a few nights previous. While her attention was thus painfully excited, she heard some of the people round her saying, "Who is it that has ventured to resist the governor's decree?" "It is William Tell, the crossbowman of Burglen," replied many voices. "William Tell," said one of the soldiers. "Why, it was his kinsman who raised a rabble to insult the ducal bonnet the other night." "Ay, it was the scapegrace, Philip Tell, who assailed the cap of our sovereign with stones till he struck it down," cried another. "Behold where the young villain stands!" exclaimed a third, pointing to Philip. "Halloo, halloo! Seize the young traitor, in the name of the Emperor and the governor!" shouted the Germans. "Run, Philip! Run, run for your life!" cried a party of his youthful associates. Philip hastily set his little cousin on his feet, and started off with the speed of the wild chamois of the Alpine mountains, leaving little Henrik to shift for himself. The child, the precious boy, he will be trampled to death!" shrieked Lalotte. Henrik had caught sight of his father among the crowd while Philip was holding him up to look at the ducal cap, and he had been much alarmed lest his father should see him. But the moment he found himself abandoned by Philip, he lifted up his voice and screamed with all his might, "Father, father!" The helplessness, the distress, together with the uncommon beauty of the child, moved the heart of a peasant near him to compassion. "Who is your father, my fair boy?" he said. "Point him out, and I will lead you to him." "My father is William Tell, the crossbowman of Burglen," said the child. "There he is close to the cap on the pole yonder." "Is he your father, poor babe?" said the peasant. "Well, you will find him in rare trouble, and I hope you may not be the means of adding to it, my little man." No sooner had the kind man cleared the way through the crowd for his young companion, and conducted him within a few yards to the spot where William Tell stood, than the urchin drew his hands away from his new friend, and running to his father, flung his little arms about his knees, sobbing, "Father, dear father, pray forgive me this once, and I will never disobey you again." Henrik made his appearance at an unlucky moment both for his father and himself, but the cruel governor of Uri, exasperated at the manly courage of Tell, seized the boy by the arm and sternly demanded if he were his son. "Harm not the child, I pray thee," cried Tell. "He is my firstborn." "It is not my intention to do him harm," replied the governor. "If any mischief befall the child, it will be by thy own hand, traitor. Here," cried he to one of his soldiers, "take this boy, tie him beneath yon linden tree in the centre of the market-place, and place an apple on his head." "What means this?" cried Tell. "I am minded to see a specimen of your skill as an archer," replied Gessler. I am told that you are the best marksman in all Uri, and therefore, your life being forfeited by your presumptuous act of disobedience, I am inclined, out of the clemency of my nature, to allow you a chance of saving it. This you may do, if you can shoot an arrow so truly aimed as to cleave the apple upon the boy's head. But if thou either miss the apple or slay the child, then shall the sentence of death be instantly executed." "Unfeeling tyrant!" exclaimed Tell. "Dost thou think I could endeavour to preserve my own life by risking that of my precious child?" "Nay," replied Gessler, "I thought I was doing thee a great favour by offering thee an alternative, whereby thou mightest preserve thy forfeited life by a lucky chance." "A lucky chance!" exclaimed Tell, "and dost thou believe that I would stake my child's life on such a desperate chance as the cast of an arrow launched by the agitated hand of an anxious father at such a mark as that? Nay, look at the child thyself, my lord. Though he be no kin to thee, and thou knowest none of his pretty ways and winning wiles, whereby he endeareth himself to a parent's heart, yet consider his innocent countenance, the artless beauty of his features, and the rosy freshness of his rounded cheeks, which are dimpling with joy at the sight of me, though the tears yet hang upon them, and then say, whether thou couldst find in thine heart to aim an arrow that perchance might harm him?" "I swear," replied Gessler, "that thou shalt either shoot the arrow or die." "My choice is soon made," said Tell, dropping the bow from his hand. "Let me die." "Ay, but the child shall be slain before thy face ere thine own sentence be executed, traitor," cried the governor, "if thou shoot not at him." "Give me the bow once more," exclaimed Tell in a hoarse, deep voice. "But in mercy let some one turn the child's face away from me. If I meet the glance of those sweet eyes of his, it will unnerve my hand, and then, perchance, the shaft, on whose true aim his life and mine depend, may err." Lalotte, knowing that all depended on his remaining quiet, as soon as the soldiers had placed him with his face averted from his father, sprang forward and whispered in Henric's ear, "Stand firm, dear boy, without moving, for 5 minutes, and you will be forgiven for your fault of this morning." There was a sudden pause of awe and expectation among the dense crowd that had gathered round the group planted within a bow's shot of the linden tree beneath which the child was bound. Tell, whose arms were now released, unbuckled the quiver that was slung across his shoulder, and carefully examined his arrows one by one. He selected 2. One of them he placed in his girdle, and the other he fitted to his bowstring, and then he raised his eyes to heaven, and his lips moved in prayer. He relied not upon his own skill, but he asked the assistance of one in whose hands are the issues of life and death. And he did not ask in vain. The trembling, agitated hand that a moment before shook with the strong emotion of a parent's anxious fears, became suddenly firm and steady. His swimming eyes resumed their keen, clear sight, and his mind recovered its wonted energy of purpose at the proper moment. Lalotte's young voice was the first to proclaim aloud, "The arrow hath cleft the apple in twain, and the child is safe." "God hath sped my shaft, and blessed be his name!" exclaimed the pious archer, on whose ear the thunders of applause, with which the assembled multitude hailed his successful shot, had fallen unheeded. The soldiers now unbound the child, and Lalotte fearlessly advanced and led him to his father. But before the fond parent could fold his darling to his bosom, the tyrant Gessler sternly demanded for what purpose he had reserved the second arrow, which he had seen him select and place in his belt. "That arrow," replied Tell, giving way to a sudden burst of passion, "that arrow was designed to avenge the death of my child, if I had slain him with the other." "How to avenge?" exclaimed the governor furiously. "To avenge, saidst thou? And on whom didst thou intend thy vengeance would fall?" "On thee, tyrant," replied Tell, fixing his eyes sternly on the governor. "My next mark would have been thy bosom, had I failed in my first. Thou perceivest that mine is not a shaft to miscarry." "Well, thou hast spoken frankly," said Gessler, "and since I have promised thee thy life, I will not swerve from my word. But as I have now reason for personal apprehensions from thy malice, I shall closet thee henceforth so safely in the dungeons of Cushnat, that the light of the sun or moon shall never more visit thine eyes, and thy fatal bow shall hereafter be harmless." On this, the guard once more laid hands on the intrepid archer, in spite of the entreaties of Lalotte and the cries and tears of little Henric, who hung weeping about his father. "Take him home to his mother, Lalotte, and bear my last fond greeting to her and the little ones, whom I, peradventure, shall see no more," said Tell, bursting into tears. The mighty heart, which had remained firm and unshaken in the midst of all his perils and trials, now melted within him at the sight of his child's tears, the remembrance of his home, and anticipations of the sufferings of his tender wife. The inhuman Gessler scarcely permitted his prisoner the satisfaction of a parting embrace with Henric and Lalotte, ere he ordered him to be hurried on board a small vessel in which he embarked also with his armed followers. He commanded the crew to row to Brunnen, where it was his intention to land, and, passing through the territory of Schwitz, to lodge the captive Tell in the dungeon of Cushnat, and there to immure him for life. The sails were hoisted and the vessel under way, when suddenly one of those storms common on the lake of Uri overtook them, accompanied with such violent gusts of wind that the terrified pilot forsook the helm, and the bark, with the governor and his crew, was in danger of being engulfed in the raging waters. Gessler, like most wicked people, was in great terror at the prospect of death, when one of his attendants reminded him that the prisoner, William Tell, was no less skilful in the management of a boat than in the exercise of the bow. So he ordered that Tell should be unbound and placed at the helm. The boat, steered by the master hand of the intrepid Tell, now kept its course steadily through the mountain surge, and Tell observed that by the grace of God he trusted a deliverance was at hand. As the prow of the vessel was driven inland, Tell perceived a solitary table rock, and called aloud the rowers to redouble their efforts, till they should have passed the precipice ahead. At the instant they came abreast this point, he snatched his bow from the plank, where it was lying forgotten during the storm, and, turning the helm suddenly toward the rock, he sprang lightly on shore, scaled the mountain, and was out of sight and beyond reach of pursuit before any on board had recovered from consternation. Tell, meantime, entered Schwitz, and having reached the height which bordered the main road to Kussnacht, concealed himself among the brushwood in a small hollow of the road, where he knew Gessler would pass on his way to the castle, in case he and his followers escaped and came safely to shore. This it appeared they did, and having effected a landing at Brunnen, they took horse and proceeded towards Kussnacht, in the direction of the only road to the castle. While they were passing the spot where Tell lay concealed, he heard the cruel tyrant denouncing the most deadly vengeance, not only on himself but his helpless family. "If I live to return to Altdorf," he exclaimed, "I will destroy the whole brood of the traitor Tell, mother and children, in the same hour." "Monster, thou shalt return to Altdorf no more," murmured Tell. So, raising himself up in his lair, and fitting an arrow to his bow, he took deadly aim at the relentless bosom that was planning the destruction of all his family. The arrow flew as truly to the mark as that which he had shot in the market-place of Altdorf, and the tyrant Gessler fell from his horse, pierced with a mortal wound. The daring archer thought he had taken his aim unseen by human eye, but to his surprise a familiar voice whispered in his ear, "Bravo, uncle! That was the best aimed shaft you ever shot. Gessler is down, and we are a free people now." "Thou incorrigible varlet, what brings thee here?" replied Tell, in an undertone, giving Philip a rough grip of the arm. "It is no time to answer questions," returned Philip. "The Rutley band are waiting for thee, if so be thou canst escape from this dangerous place, and my business here was to give thee notice of the same." On this, Tell crept softly from the thicket, and, followed by his nephew, took the road to Steinen, which under cover of darkness they reached that night. Philip, by the way, after expressing much contrition for having seduced little Henrik to go to the fair with him, informed his uncle that Henrik and Lalotte had been safely conducted home by one of the band of the Rutley, who chanced to be at Altdorf fair. When they reached Steinen, Tell was received with open arms by Stauffer, the leader of the Rutley band, and with him the other confederates. He so well concerted measures for the deliverance of Switzerland from the German yoke, that, in the course of a few days, the whole country was in arms. The Emperor of Germany's forces was everywhere defeated, and on the first day of the year, 1308, the independence of Switzerland was declared. His grateful countrymen would have chosen William Tell for their sovereign, but he nobly rejected the offer, declaring that he was perfectly contented with the station of life in which he was born, and wished to be remembered in history by no other title than that of the deliverer of Switzerland. The true patriot lived happily in the bosom of his family for many years, and had the satisfaction of seeing his children grow up in the fear of God and the practice of virtue. End of Section 18.
Section 19 of Heroes Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Heroes Every Child Should Know. Edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie. Section 19. Robert Bruce, Part 1. Adapted from Tales of a Grandfather from Scottish History, by Sir Walter Scott. I hope you have not forgotten, my dear child, that all the cruel wars of Scotland arose out of the debate between the great lords who claimed the throne after King Alexander III's death. The Scottish nobility rashly submitted the decision of that matter to King Edward I of England, and thus opened the way to his endeavouring to seize the kingdom of Scotland to himself. It was natural that such of the people as were still determined to fight for the deliverance of their country from the English should look round for some other king, under whom they might unite themselves to combat the power of England. Amongst these, the principal candidates were two powerful noblemen. The first was Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick. The other was John Comyn, or Cuming, of Badenoch, usually called the Red Comyn, to distinguish him from his kinsman, the Black Comyn, so named for his swarthy complexion. These two great and powerful barons had taken part with Sir William Wallace in the wars against England, but, after his defeat, being careful of losing their great estates, and considering the freedom of Scotland as beyond the possibility of being recovered, both Bruce and Comyn had not only submitted themselves to Edward, and acknowledged his title as King of Scotland, but even borne arms, along with the English, against such of their countrymen as still continued to resist the usurper. But the feelings of Bruce concerning the baseness of this conduct are said, by the old tradition of Scotland, to have been awakened by the following incident. In one of the numerous battles or skirmishes which took place at the time between the English and their adherents on the one side, and the insurgent or patriotic Scots upon the other, Robert the Bruce was present, and assisted the English to gain the victory. After the battle was over, he sat down to dinner among his southern friends and allies, without washing his hands, on which there still remained spots of the blood which he had shed during the action. The English lords, observing this, whispered to each other in mockery, "Look at that Scotsman, who is eating his own blood." Bruce heard what they said, and began to reflect that the blood of his hands might be indeed called his own, since it was that of his brave countrymen who were fighting for the independence of Scotland, whilst he was assisting its oppressors, who only laughed at and mocked him for his unnatural conduct. He was so much shocked and disgusted that he arose from table, and going into a neighbouring chapel shed many tears, and asking pardon of God for the great crime he had been guilty of, made a solemn vow that he would atone for it by doing all in his power to deliver Scotland from the foreign yoke. Accordingly he left, it is said, the English army, and never joined it again, but remained watching an opportunity for restoring the freedom of his country. Now this Robert the Bruce was held the best warrior in Scotland. He was very wise and prudent, and an excellent general. That is, he knew how to conduct an army, and place them in order for battle, as well or better than any great man of his time. He was generous too, and courteous by nature, but he had some faults, which perhaps belonged as much to the fierce period in which he lived as to his own character. He was rash and passionate, and in his passion he was sometimes relentless and cruel. Robert the Bruce had fixed his purpose, as I told you, to attempt once again to drive the English out of Scotland, and he desired to prevail upon Sir John, the Red Comyn, who was his rival in his pretensions to the throne, to join with him in expelling the foreign enemy by their common efforts. With this purpose Bruce requested an interview with John Comyn. They met in the church of the Minorities in Dumfries, before the high altar. What passed betwixt them is not known with certainty, but they quarrelled, either concerning their mutual pretensions to the crown, or because Comyn refused to join Bruce in the proposed insurrection against the English, or, as many writers say, because Bruce charged Comyn with having betrayed to the English his purpose of rising up against King Edward. It is, however, certain that these two haughty barons came to high and abusive words, until, at length, Bruce forgot the sacred character of the place in which they stood, and struck Comyn a blow with his dagger. Having done this rash deed, he instantly ran out of the church and called for his horse. Two friends of Bruce were in attendance on him. Seeing him pale, bloody, and in much agitation, they eagerly inquired what was the matter. "I doubt," said Bruce, "that I have slain the Red Comyn." "Do you leave such a matter in doubt?" said one. "I will make sicker, that is, I will make certain." Accordingly, he and his companion rushed into the church, and made the matter certain with a vengeance, by dispatching the wounded Comyn with their daggers. His uncle, Sir Robert Comyn, was slain at the same time. This slaughter of Comyn was a rash and cruel action. It was followed by the displeasure of Heaven, for no man ever went through more misfortunes than Robert Bruce, although he at length rose to great honour. After the deed was done, Bruce might be called desperate. He had committed an action which was sure to bring down upon him the vengeance of all Comyn's relations, the resentment of the King of England, and the displeasure of the Church, on account of having slain his enemy within consecrated ground. He determined therefore to bid them all defiance at once, and to assert his pretensions to the throne of Scotland. He drew his own followers together, summoned to meet him such barons as still entertained hopes of the freedom of the country, and was crowned king at the Abbey of Scone, the usual place where the kings of Scotland assumed their authority. Everything relating to the ceremony was hastily performed. A small circlet of gold was hurriedly made, to represent the ancient crown of Scotland, which Edward had carried off to England. The Earl of Fife, descendant of the brave Macduff, whose duty it was to have placed the crown on the king's head, would not give his attendance. But the ceremonial was performed by his sister Isabella, Countess of Buchan. Edward was dreadfully incensed when he heard that, after all the pains which he had taken, and all the blood which had been spilled, the Scots were making this new attempt to shake off his authority. Though now old, feeble, and sickly, he made a solemn vow, in presence of all his court, that he would take the most ample vengeance upon Robert the Bruce and his adherents, after which he would never again draw his sword upon a Christian, but would only fight against the unbelieving Saracens for the recovery of the Holy Land. He marched against Bruce accordingly, at the head of a powerful army. The commencement of Bruce's undertaking was most disastrous. He was crowned on the 29th of March, 1306. On the 18th of May he was excommunicated by the Pope, on account of the murder of Comyn within consecrated ground, a sentence which excluded him from all benefits of religion, and authorized anyone to kill him. Finally, on the 19th of June, the new king was completely defeated near Methven by the English Earl of Pembroke. Robert's horse was killed under him in the action, and he was for a moment a prisoner. But he had fallen into the power of a Scottish knight, who, though he served in the English army, did not choose to be the instrument of putting Bruce into their hands, and allowed him to escape. Bruce, with a few brave adherents, among whom was the young Lord of Douglas, who was afterward called the good Lord James, retired into the Highland mountains. The Bruce's wife, now Queen of Scotland, with several other ladies, accompanied her husband and his few followers during their wanderings. There was no way of providing for them save by hunting and fishing. Driven from one place in the Highlands to another, starved out of some districts, and forced from others by the opposition of the inhabitants, Bruce attempted to force his way into Lorne, but he found enemies everywhere. The MacDougals, a powerful family, then called Lords of Lorne, were friendly to the English, and attacked Bruce and his wandering companions as soon as they attempted to enter their territory. The chief, called John of Lorne, hated Bruce on account of his having slain the Red Comyn, to whom this MacDougall was nearly related. Bruce was again defeated by this chief. He directed his men to retreat through a narrow pass, and, placing himself last of the party, he fought with and slew such of the enemy as attempted to press hard on them. 3 followers of MacDougall, a father and 2 sons, called Macandrossa, all very strong men, when they saw Bruce thus protecting the retreat of his followers, rushed on the king at once. Bruce was on horseback, in the straight pass, betwixt a precipitous rock and a deep lake. He struck the first man a blow with his sword, as cut off his hand and freed the bridle. The man bled to death. The other brother had meantime grasped Bruce by the leg, and was attempting to throw him from horseback. The king, setting spurs to his horse, made the animal suddenly spring forward, so that the Highlander fell under the horse's feet, and, as he was endeavouring to rise again, Bruce cleft his head in two with his sword. The father, seeing his two sons thus slain, flew desperately at the king, and grasped him by the mantle so close to his body that he could not have room to wield his long sword. But with the heavy pummel of that weapon the king struck his third assailant so dreadful a blow that he dashed out his brains. Still, however, the Highlander kept his dying grasp on the king's mantle, so that, to be free of the dead body, Bruce was obliged to undo the brooch, or clasp, by which it was fastened, and leave that and the mantle itself behind him. The brooch, which thus fell into the possession of MacDougall of Lorne, is still preserved in that ancient family as a memorial. The king met with many such encounters amidst his dangerous and dismal wanderings. Yet, though almost always defeated by the superior numbers of the English, and of such Scots as tided with them, he still kept up his own spirits and those of his followers. He was a better scholar than was usual in those days, when, except clergymen, few people learned to read and write. But King Robert could do both very well, and we are told that he sometimes read aloud to his companions, to amuse them, when they were crossing the great Highland lakes, in such wretched leaky boats as they could find for that purpose. Loch Lomond, in particular, is said to have been the scene of such a lecture. You may see by this how useful it is to possess knowledge. At last dangers increased so much around the brave King Robert that he was obliged to separate himself from his queen and her ladies. So Bruce left his queen, with the Countess of Buchan and others, in the only castle which remained to him, which was called Kildrummie, and is situated near the head of the river Don in Aberdeenshire. The king also left his brother, Nigel Bruce, to defend the castle against the English, and he himself, with his second brother Edward, who was a very brave man, went over to an island called Rachrin, on the coast of Ireland, where Bruce and the few men who followed his fortunes passed the winter of 1306. In the meantime, the castle of Kildrummie was taken by the English, and Nigel Bruce, a beautiful and brave youth, was cruelly put to death by the victors. The ladies who had attended on Robert's queen, as well as the queen herself and the Countess of Buchan, were thrown into strict confinement. The Countess of Buchan had given Edward great offence by being the person who placed the crown on the head of Robert Bruce. She was imprisoned within the castle of Berwick in a cage. The cage was a strong wooden and iron piece of framework, placed within an apartment, and resembling one of those places in which wild beasts are confined. There were such cages in most old prisons, to which captives were consigned, who were to be confined with peculiar rigour. The news of the taking of Kildrummie, the captivity of his wife, and the execution of his brother, reached Bruce while he was residing in a miserable dwelling at Rachrin, and reduced him to the point of despair. After receiving the intelligence from Scotland, Bruce was lying one morning on his wretched bed, and deliberating with himself whether he had not better resign all thoughts of again attempting to make good his right to the Scottish crown, and, dismissing his followers, transport himself and his brothers to the Holy Land, and spend the rest of his life in fighting against the Saracens. But then, on the other hand, he thought it would be both criminal and cowardly to give up his attempts to restore freedom to Scotland, while there yet remained the least chance of his being successful in an undertaking which, rightly considered, was much more his duty than to drive the infidels out of Palestine. While he was divided betwixt these reflections, and doubtful of what he should do, Bruce was looking upward to the roof of the cabin in which he lay, and his eye was attracted by a spider, which, hanging at the end of a long thread of its own spinning, was endeavouring to swing itself from one beam in the roof to another, for the purpose of fixing the line on which it meant to stretch its web. The insect made the attempt again and again without success. At length Bruce counted that it had tried to carry its point 6 times, and been as often unable to do so. It came into his head that he himself fought just 6 battles against the English and their allies, and that the poor persevering Spider was exactly in the same situation with himself, having made as many trials and been as often disappointed in what it aimed at. Now, thought Bruce, as I have no means of knowing what is best to be done, I will be guided by the luck which shall attend this Spider. If the insect shall make another effort to fix its thread, and shall be successful, I will venture a 7th time to try my fortune in Scotland. But if the Spider shall fail, I will go to the wars in Palestine, and never return to my native country more. While Bruce was forming this resolution, the Spider made another exertion with all the force it could muster, and fairly succeeded in fastening its thread to the beam which it had so often in vain attempted to reach. Bruce, seeing the success of the Spider, resolved to try his own fortune, and as he had never before gained a victory, so he never afterwards sustained any considerable or decisive check or defeat. I have often met with people of the name of Bruce, so completely persuaded of the truth of this story, that they would not on any account kill a Spider, because it was that insect which has shown the example of perseverance, and given a signal of good luck to their great namesake. Having determined to renew his efforts to obtain possession of Scotland, the Bruce removed himself and his followers from Rachrin to the island of Arran, which lies in the mouth of the Clyde. The king landed, and inquired of the first woman he met what armed men were in the island. She returned for answer that there had arrived there very lately a body of armed strangers, who had defeated an English governor of the castle, and were now amusing themselves with hunting about the island. The king, having caused himself to be guided to the woods which these strangers most frequented, there blew his horn repeatedly. Now the chief of the strangers who had taken the castle was James Douglas, one of the best of Bruce's friends, and he was accompanied by some of the bravest of that patriotic band. When he heard Robert Bruce's horn, he knew the sound well, and cried out that yonder was the king. He knew by his manner of blowing. So he and his companions hastened to meet King Robert. They could not help weeping when they considered their own forlorn condition, but they were stout-hearted men, and yet looked forward to freeing their country. The Bruce was now where the people were most likely to be attached to him. He continued to keep himself concealed in his own earldom of Carrick, and in the neighbouring country of Galloway, until he should have matters ready for a general attack upon the English. He was obliged in the meantime to keep very few men with him, both for the sake of secrecy and from the difficulty of finding provisions. Now many of the people of Galloway were unfriendly to Bruce. They lived under the government of one Macdonald, related to the Lord of Lorne, who had defeated Bruce. These Galloway men had heard that Bruce was in their country, having no more than 60 men with him, so they resolved to attack him by surprise, and for this purpose they got together and brought with them 2 or 3 bloodhounds. At that time bloodhounds, or sleuth-hounds, were used for the purpose of pursuing great criminals. The men of Galloway thought that if they missed taking Bruce, or killing him at the first onset, and if he should escape into the woods, they would find him out by means of these bloodhounds. The good King Robert Bruce, who was always watchful and vigilant, received some information of the intention of the party to come upon him suddenly and by night. Accordingly, he quartered his little troop of 60 men on the side of a deep and swift-running river, that had very steep and rocky banks. There was but one ford by which this river could be crossed in that neighbourhood, and that ford was deep and narrow, so that 2 men could scarcely get through abreast. The ground on which they were to land, on the side where the king was steep, and the path which led upward from the water's edge to the top of the bank extremely narrow and difficult. Bruce caused his men to lie down to take some sleep, at a place about half a mile distant from the river, while he himself, with 2 attendants, went down to watch the ford. He stood looking at the ford, and thinking how easily the enemy might be kept from passing there, provided it was bravely defended, when he heard, always coming nearer and nearer, the baying of a hound. This was the bloodhound which was tracing the king's step to the ford where he had crossed, and 200 Galloway men were along with the animal, and guided by it. Bruce at first thought of going back to awaken his men, but then he reflected that it might be only some shepherd's dog. "My men," said he, "are sorely tired. I will not disturb their sleep for the yelping of a cur, till I know something more of the matter." So he stood and listened, and by, as the cry of the hound came nearer, he began to hear a trampling of horses, and the voices of men, and the ringing and clattering of armour. And then he was sure the enemy were coming to the riverside. Then the king thought, "If I go back to give my men the alarm, these Galloway men will get through the ford without opposition, and that would be a pity, since it is a place so advantageous to make defence against them." So he looked again at the steep path and the deep river, and he thought that they gave him so much advantage that he himself could defend the passage with his own hand, until his men came to assist him. He therefore sent his followers to waken his men, and remained alone by the river. End of section 19.
Section 20 of Heroes Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Penn. Heroes Every Child Should Know. Edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie. Section 20. Robert Bruce, Part 2. Adapted from Tales of a Grandfather from Scottish History by Sir Walter Scott. The noise and trampling of the horses increased, and the moon being bright, Bruce beheld the glancing arms of 200 men on the opposite bank. The men of Galloway, on their part, saw but one solitary figure guarding the ford, and the foremost of them plunged into the river without minding him. But as they could only pass the ford one by one, the Bruce, who stood high above them on the bank where they were to land, killed the foremost man with a thrust of his long spear, and with a second thrust stabbed the horse, which fell down, kicking and plunging in his agonies, on the narrow path, and so prevented the others who were following from getting out of the river. Bruce had thus an opportunity of dealing his blows among them, while they could not strike at him. In the confusion, 5 or 6 of the enemy were slain, or, having been borne down with the current, were drowned. The rest were terrified and drew back. But when the Galloway men looked again, and saw they were opposed by only one man, they themselves being so many, they cried out that their honor would be lost forever if they did not force their way, and encouraged each other with loud cries to plunge through and assault him. But by this time the king's soldiers came up to his assistance, and the Galloway men gave up their enterprise. About the time when the Bruce was yet at the head of but few men, Sir Aymer de Valence, who was Earl of Pembroke, together with Sir John of Lorne, came into Galloway, each of them being at the head of a large body of men. John of Lorne had a bloodhound with him, which it was said had formerly belonged to Robert Bruce himself, and having been fed by the king with his own hands, it became attached to him, and would follow his footsteps anywhere, as dogs are well known to trace their master's steps, whether they be bloodhounds or not. By means of this hound, John of Lorne thought he should certainly find out Bruce, and take revenge on him for the death of his relation Comyn. The king saw that he was followed by a large body, and being determined to escape from them, he made all the people who were with him disperse themselves different ways, thinking thus that the enemy must needs lose trace of him. He kept only one man along with him, and that was his own foster brother, or the son of his nurse. When John of Lorne came to the place where Bruce's companions had dispersed themselves, the bloodhound, after it had sniffed up and down for a little, quitted the footsteps of all the other fugitives, and ran barking upon the track of 2 men out of the whole number. Then John of Lorne knew that one of these 2 must needs be King Robert. Accordingly, he commanded 5 of his men that were speedy of foot to chase after him, and either make him prisoner or slay him. The Highlanders started off accordingly, and ran so fast that they gained sight of Robert and his foster brother. The king asked his companion what help he could give him, and his foster brother answered he was ready to do his best. So these 2 turned on the 5 men of John of Lorne and killed them all. But by this time Bruce very much fatigued, and yet they dared not sit down to take any rest. For whenever they stopped for an instant, they heard the cry of the bloodhound behind them, and knew by that their enemies were coming up fast after them. At length they came to a wood, through which ran a small river. Then Bruce said to his foster brother, "Let us wade down this stream for a great way, instead of going straight across, and so this unhappy hound will lose the scent. For if we were once clear of him, I should not be afraid of getting away from the pursuers." Accordingly, the king and his attendant walked a great way down the stream, taking care to keep their feet in the water, which could not retain any scent where they had stepped. Then they came ashore on the further side from the enemy, and went deep into the wood before they stopped to rest themselves. In the meanwhile, the hound led John of Lorne straight to the place where the king went into the water. But there the dog began to be puzzled, not knowing where to go next. So John of Lorne, seeing the dog had lost track, gave up the chase, and returned to join with Aymer de Valence. But King Robert's adventures were not yet ended. It was now near night, and he went boldly into a farmhouse, where he found the mistress, an old true-hearted Scotswoman, sitting alone. Upon seeing a stranger enter, she asked him who and what he was. The king answered that he was a traveler, who was journeying through the country. "All travelers," answered the good woman, "are welcome here for the sake of one." "And who is that one?" said the king, "for whose sake you make all welcome?" "It is our rightful king, Robert the Bruce," answered the mistress, "and although he is now pursued and hunted after with hounds and horns, I hope to live to see him king over all Scotland." "Since you love him so well, madam," said the king, "know that you see him before you. I am Robert the Bruce." "You," said the good woman in great surprise, "and wherefore are you thus alone? Where are all your men?" "I have none with me at this moment," answered Bruce, "and therefore I must travel alone." "But that shall not be," said the brave old dame, "for I have 2 stout sons, gallant and trusty men, who shall be your servants for life and death." So she brought her 2 sons, and though she well knew the dangers to which she exposed them, she made them swear fidelity to the king. Now the loyal woman was getting everything ready for the king's supper, when suddenly there was a great trampling of horses heard round the house. They thought it must be some of the English, or John of Lorne's men, and the good wife called upon her sons to fight to the last for King Robert. But shortly after, they heard the voice of the good Lord James of Douglas, and of Edward Bruce, the king's brother, who had come with 150 horsemen, according to the instructions that the king had left with them at parting. Robert the Bruce was right joyful to meet his brother and his faithful friend Lord James, and had no sooner found himself once more at the head of such a considerable body of followers that he forgot hunger and weariness. There was nothing but mount and ride, and as the Scots rushed suddenly into the village where the English were quartered, they easily dispersed and cut them to pieces. The consequence of these successes of King Robert was that soldiers came to join him on all sides, and that he obtained several victories over English commanders, until at length the English were afraid to venture into the open country, as formerly, unless when they could assemble themselves in considerable bodies. They thought it safer to lie still in the towns and castles which they had garrisoned. Edward I would have entered Scotland at the head of a large army, before he had left Bruce time to conquer back the country. But very fortunately for the Scots, that wise and skilful, though ambitious king, died when he was on the point of marching into Scotland. His son Edward, too, neglected the Scottish war, and thus lost the opportunity of defeating Bruce when his force was small. But when Sir Philip Mowbray, the governor of Stirling, came to London to tell the king that Stirling, the last Scottish town of importance which remained in possession of the English, was to be surrendered if it were not relieved by force of arms before midsummer, then all the English nobles called out, it would be a sin and shame to permit the fair conquest which Edward I had made to be forfeited to the Scots for want of fighting. King Edward II, therefore, assembled one of the greatest armies which a king of England ever commanded. There were troops brought from all his dominions, many brave soldiers from the French provinces, many Irish, many Welsh, and all the great English nobles and barons with their followers. The number was not less than 100,000 men. King Robert the Bruce summoned all his nobles and barons to join him, when he heard of the great preparations which the King of England was making. They were not so numerous as the English by many thousand men. In fact, his whole army did not very much exceed 30,000, and they were much worse armed than the wealthy Englishmen. But then, Robert was one of the most expert generals of the time, and the officers he had under him were his brother Edward, his faithful follower the Douglas, and other brave and experienced leaders. His men had been accustomed to fight and gain victories under every disadvantage of situation and numbers. The king, on his part, studied how he might supply, by address and stratagem, what he wanted in numbers and strength. He knew the superiority of the English in their heavy armed cavalry and in their archers, but these advantages he resolved to provide against. With this purpose, he led his army down into a plain near Stirling. The English army must needs pass through a boggy country, broken with water courses, while the Scots occupied hard, dry ground. He then caused all the ground upon the front of his line of battle to be dug full of holes, about as deep as a man's knee. They were filled with light brushwood, and the turf was laid on the top, so that it appeared a plain field, while in reality it was as full of these pits as a honeycomb is of holes. He also, it is said, caused steel spikes, called calthrops, to be scattered up and down in the plain, where the English cavalry were most likely to advance, trusting in that manner to lame and destroy their horses. When the Scottish army was drawn up, the line stretched north and south. On the south, it was terminated by the banks of the brook called Bannockburn, which are so rocky that no troops could attack them there. On the left, the Scottish line extended near to the town of Stirling. Bruce reviewed his troops very carefully. He then spoke to the soldiers and expressed his determination to gain the victory or to lose his life on the field of battle. He desired that all those who did not propose to fight to the last should leave the field before the battle began, and that none should remain except those who were determined to take the issue of victory or death as God should send it. When the main body of his army was thus placed in order, the king dispatched James of Douglas and Sir Robert Keith, the marshal of the Scottish army, in order that they might survey the English force. They returned with information that the approach of that vast host was one of the most beautiful and terrible sights which could be seen, that the whole country seemed covered with men at arms of horse and foot. It was upon the 23rd of June, 1314, the King of Scotland heard the news that the English army was approaching Stirling. The van now came in sight, and a number of their bravest knights drew near to see what the Scots were doing. They saw King Robert dressed in his armor, and distinguished by a gold crown, which he wore over his helmet. He was not mounted on his great war horse, because he did not expect to fight that evening, but he rode on a little pony up and down the ranks of his army, putting his men in order, and carried in his hand a sort of battle axe made of steel. When the king saw the English horsemen draw near, he advanced a little before his own men, that he might look at them more nearly. There was a knight among the English called Sir Henry de Bohun, who thought this would be a good opportunity to gain great fame to himself, and put an end to the war by killing King Robert. The king being poorly mounted, and having no lance, Bohun galloped on him suddenly and furiously, thinking, with his long spear and his tall, powerful horse, easily to bear him down to the ground. King Robert saw him, and permitted him to come very near, then suddenly turned his pony a little to one side, so that Sir Henry missed him with the lance point, and was in the act of being carried past him by the career of his horse. But as he passed, King Robert rose up in his stirrups, and struck Sir Henry on the head with his battle axe so terrible a blow that it broke to pieces his iron helmet as if it had been a nutshell, and hurled him from his saddle. He was dead before he reached the ground. This gallant action was blamed by the Scottish leaders, who thought Bruce ought not to have exposed himself to so much danger when the safety of the whole army depended on him. The king only kept looking at his weapon, which was injured by the force of the blow, and said, "I have broken my good battle axe." The next morning, the English king ordered his men to begin the battle. The archers then bent their bows, and began to shoot so closely together that the arrows fell like flakes of snow on a Christmas day. They killed many of the Scots, and might have decided the victory. But Bruce was prepared for them. A body of men-at-arms, well mounted, rode at full gallop among them, and as the archers had no weapons save their bows and arrows, which they could not use when they were attacked hand to hand, they were cut down in great numbers by the Scottish horsemen and thrown into total confusion. The fine English cavalry then advanced to support their archers. But coming over the ground, which was dug full of pits, the horses fell into these holes, and the riders lay tumbling about, without any means of defense, and unable to rise from the weight of their armor. While the battle was obstinately maintained on both sides, an event happened which decided the victory. The servants and attendants on the Scottish camp had been sent behind the army to a place afterward called the Gillies Hill. But when they saw that their masters were likely to gain the day, they rushed from their place of concealment with such weapons as they could get, that they might have their share in the victory and in the spoil. The English, seeing them come suddenly over the hill, mistook this disorderly rabble for a new army coming up to sustain the Scots, and, losing all heart, began to shift every man for himself. Edward himself left the field as fast as he could ride. The English, at this great defeat, were no longer in a condition to support their pretensions to be masters of Scotland, or to continue to send armies into that country to overcome it. On the contrary, they became for a time scarce able to defend their own frontiers against King Robert and his soldiers. Thus did Robert Bruce arise from the condition of an exile, hunted with bloodhounds like a stag or beast of prey, to the rank of an independent sovereign, universally acknowledged to be one of the wisest and bravest kings who then lived. The nation of Scotland was also raised once more from the situation of a distressed and conquered province to that of a free and independent state, governed by its own laws. Robert Bruce continued to reign gloriously for several years, and the Scots seemed, during his government, to have acquired a complete superiority over their neighbors. But then we must remember that Edward II, who then reigned in England, was a foolish prince, and listened to bad counsels, so that it is no wonder that he was beaten by so wise and experienced a general as Robert Bruce, who had fought his way to the crown through so many disasters, and acquired in consequence so much renown. In the last year of Robert the Bruce's reign, he became extremely sickly and infirm, chiefly owing to a disorder called the leprosy, which he had caught during the hardships and misfortunes of his youth, when he was so frequently obliged to hide himself in woods and morasses, without a roof to shelter him. He lived at a castle called Cardross, on the beautiful banks of the river Clyde, near to where it joins the sea, and his chief amusement was to go upon the river and down to the sea in a ship, which he kept for his pleasure. He was no longer able to sit upon his war horse, or to lead his army to the field. While Bruce was in this feeble state, Edward II, King of England, died, and was succeeded by his son Edward III. He turned out afterward to be one of the wisest and bravest kings whom England ever had, but when he first mounted the throne he was very young. The war between the English and the Scots still lasted at the time, but finally a peace was concluded with Robert Bruce on terms highly honorable to Scotland, for the English king renounced all pretensions to the sovereignty of the country. Good King Robert did not long survive this joyful event. He was not aged more than 54 years, but his bad health was caused by the hardships which he sustained during his youth, and at length he became very ill. Finding that he could not recover, he assembled around his bedside the nobles and counselors in whom he most trusted. He told them that now, being on his deathbed, he sorely repented all his misdeeds, and particularly that he had, in his passion, killed Cullum with his own hand in the church and before the altar. He said that if he had lived, he had intended to go to Jerusalem to make war upon the Saracens, who held the Holy Land, as some expiation for the evil deeds he had done. But since he was about to die, he requested of his dearest friend and bravest warrior, and that was the good Lord James Douglas, that he should carry his heart to the Holy Land. Douglas wept bitterly as he accepted this office, the last mark of the Bruce's confidence and friendship. The king soon afterward expired, and his heart was taken out from his body and embalmed, that is, prepared with spices and perfumes, that it might remain a long time fresh and uncorrupted. Then the Douglas caused a case of silver to be made, into which he put the Bruce's heart, and wore it around his neck by a string of silk and gold. And he set forward for the Holy Land with a gallant train of the bravest men in Scotland, who, to show their value of and sorrow for their brave King Robert Bruce, resolved to attend his heart to the city of Jerusalem. In going to Palestine, Douglas landed in Spain, where the Saracen king, or Sultan of Granada, called Osman, was invading the realms of Alfonso, the Spanish king of Castile. King Alfonso received Douglas with great honor and distinction, and easily persuaded the Scottish earl that he would do good service to the Christian cause by assisting him to drive back the Saracens of Granada before proceeding on his voyage to Jerusalem. Lord Douglas and his followers went accordingly to a great battle against Osman, and had little difficulty in defeating the Saracens. But being ignorant of the mode of fighting among the cavalry of the East, the Scots pursued the chase too far, and the Moors, when they saw them scattered and separated from each other, turned suddenly back, with a loud cry of Allah, 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 which is their shout of battle, and surrounded such of the Scottish knights and squires as were dispersed from each other. In this new skirmish, Douglas saw Sir William St. Clair of Roslin fighting desperately, surrounded by many Moors, who were having at him with their sabres. "Yonder worthy knight will be slain," Douglas said, "unless he have instant help." With that he galloped to his rescue, but presently saw himself also surrounded by many Moors. When he found the enemy pressed so thick around him as to leave him no chance of escaping, the Earl took from his neck the Bruce's heart, and speaking to it, as he would have done to the king, had he been alive, "Pass first in fight," he said, "as thou wert wont to do, and Douglas will follow thee or die." He then threw the king's heart among the enemy, and rushing forward to the place where it fell, was there slain. His body was found lying above the silver case, as if it had been his last object to defend the Bruce's heart. Such of the Scottish knights as remained alive returned to their own country. They brought back the heart of the Bruce and the bones of the good Lord James. The Bruce's heart was buried below the high altar in Melrose Abbey. As for his body, it was laid in the sepulchre in the midst of the church of Dunfermline, under a marble stone. The church afterward becoming ruinous, and the roof falling down with age, the monument was broken to pieces, and nobody could tell where it stood. But when they were repairing the church of Dunfermline, and removing the rubbish, lo, they found fragments of the marble tomb of Robert Bruce. Then they began to dig farther, thinking to discover the body of this celebrated monarch, and at length they came to the skeleton of a tall man, and they knew it must be that of King Robert, both as he was known to have been buried in a winding sheet of cloth of gold, of which many fragments were found about the skeleton, and also because the breastbone appeared to have been sawed through in order to take the heart. A new tomb was prepared, into which the bones were laid with profound respect. End of section 20. Recording by John Penn.
Section 21 of Heroes Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Heroes Every Child Should Know, edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie. Section 21. George Washington. Adapted from Recollections and Private Memoirs of Washington by G. W. Parke Custis. On the 4th of March, 1797, Washington went to the inauguration of his successor as President of the United States. The federal government was sitting in Philadelphia at that time, and Congress held sessions in the courthouse on the corner of 6th and Chestnut Streets. At the appointed hour, Washington entered the hall, followed by John Adams, who was to take the oath of office. When they were seated, Washington arose and introduced Mr. Adams to the audience, and then proceeded to read in a firm, clear voice his brief valedictory, not his great farewell address, for that had already been published. A lady who sat on the front bench immediately in front of Washington describes the scene in these words: "There was a narrow passage from the door of the entrance to the room. General Washington stopped at the end to let Mr. Adams pass to the chair. The latter always wore a full suit of bright drab, with loose cuffs to his coat. General Washington's dress was a full suit of black. His military hat had the black cockade. There stood the father of his country, acknowledged by nations the first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. No marshals with gold-colored scarfs attended him. There was no cheering, no noise. The most profound silence greeted him, as if the great assembly desired to hear him breathe. Mr. Adams covered his face with both his hands. The sleeves of his coat and his hands were covered with tears. Every now and then there was a suppressed sob. I cannot describe Washington's appearance as I felt it, perfectly composed and self-possessed till the close of his address. Then, when strong, nervous sobs broke loose, when tears covered the faces, then the great man was shaken. I never took my eyes from his face. Large drops came from his eyes. He looked as if his heart was with them, and would be to the end. On Washington's retirement from the presidency, one of his first employments was to arrange his papers and letters. Then, on returning to his home, the venerable master found many things to repair. His landed estate comprised 8,000 acres, and was divided into farms, with enclosures and farm buildings. And now, with body and mind alike sound and vigorous, he bent his energies to directing the improvements that marked his last days at Mount Vernon. In his earlier as well as in later life, his tour of the farms would average from 8 to 12 or 14 miles a day. He rode upon his farms entirely unattended, opening his gates, pulling down and putting up his fences as he passed, visiting his laborers at their work, inspecting all the operations of his extensive establishment with a careful eye, directing useful improvements and superintending them in their progress. He usually rode at a moderate pace in passing through his fields, but when behind time, this most punctual of men would display the horsemanship of his earlier days, and a hard gallop would bring him up to time, so that the sound of his horse's hoofs and the first dinner bell would be heard together at 3:15. A story is told that one day an elderly stranger, meeting a revolutionary worthy out hunting, a long-tried and valued friend of the chief, accosted him and asked whether Washington was to be found at the mansion house, or whether he was off riding over his estate. The friend answered that he was visiting his farms, and directed the stranger the road to take, adding, "You will meet, sir, with an old gentleman riding alone in plain drab clothes, a broad-brimmed white hat, a hickory switch in his hand, and carrying an umbrella with a long staff, which is attached to his saddle-bow. That person, sir, is General Washington." Precisely at 3:15 the industrious farmer returned, dressed, and dined at 3 o'clock. At this meal he ate heartily, but was not particular in his diet, with the exception of fish, of which he was excessively fond. Touching his liking of fish, and illustrative of his practical economy and abhorrence of waste and extravagance, an anecdote is told of the time he was president and living in Philadelphia. It happened that a single shad had been caught in the Delaware and brought to the city market. His steward, Sam Francis, pounced upon the fish with the speed of an osprey, delighted that he had secured a delicacy agreeable to the palate of his chief, and careless of the expense, for which the president had often rebuked him. When the fish was served, Washington suspected the steward had forgotten his order about expenditure for the table, and said to Francis, who stood at his post at the sideboard, "What fish is this?" "A shad, sir, a very fine shad," the steward answered. "I know your excellency is particularly fond of this kind of fish, and was so fortunate as to procure this one, the only one in market, sir, the first of the season." "The price, sir, the price?" asked Washington sternly. $3, stammered the conscience-stricken steward. "Take it away," thundered the chief. "Take it away, sir. It shall never be said that my table set such an example of luxury and extravagance." Poor Francis, trembling, did as he was told, and the first shad of the season was carried away untouched, to be speedily discussed in the servants' dining-room. Although the farmer of Mount Vernon was much retired from the business world, he was by no means inattentive to the progress of public affairs. When the post-bag arrived, he would select his letters and lay them aside for reading in the seclusion of his library. The newspapers he would peruse while taking his single cup of tea, his only supper, and read aloud passages of peculiar interest, remarking the matter as he went along. He read with distinctness and precision. These evenings with his family always ended at precisely 9 o'clock, when he bade everyone good night and retired to rest, to rise again at 4 and renew the same routine of labor and enjoyment. Washington's last days, like those that preceded them in the course of a long and well-spent life, were devoted to constant and careful employment. His correspondence both at home and abroad was immense, yet no letter was unanswered. One of the best-bred men of his time, Washington deemed it a grave offense against the rules of good manners and propriety to leave letters unanswered. He wrote with great facility, and it would be a difficult matter to find another who had written so much, who had written so well. General Henry Lee once observed to him, "We are amazed, sir, at the vast amount of work you get through." Washington answered, "Sir, I rise at 4 o'clock, and a great deal of my work is done while others sleep." He was the most punctual of men, as we said. To this admirable quality of rising at 4 and retiring to rest at 9 at all seasons, this great man owed his ability to accomplish mighty labors during his long and illustrious life. He was punctual in everything, and made everyone about him punctual. So careful a man delighted in always having about him a good timekeeper. In Philadelphia, the first president regularly walked up to his watchmakers to compare his watch with the regulator. At Mount Vernon, the active yet punctual farmer invariably consulted the dial when returning from his morning ride, and before entering his house. The affairs of the household took order from the master's accurate and methodical arrangement of time. Even the fisherman on the river watched for the clock's signal when to pull ashore and deliver his catch in time for dinner. Among the picturesque objects on the Potomac, to be seen from the eastern portion of the mansion house, was the light canoe of the house's fisher. Father Jack was an African, and 100 years of age, and although enfeebled in body by weight of years, his mind possessed uncommon vigor, and he would tell of days long past when, under African suns, he was made captive, and of the terrible battle in which his royal sire was slain, the village burned, and himself sent to the slave ship. Father Jack had, in a considerable degree, a leading quality of his race, somnolency. Many an hour could the family of Washington see the canoe fastened to a stake, with the old fisherman bent nearly double enjoying a nap, which was only disturbed by the jerking of the white perch caught on his hook. But, as we just said, the domestic duties of Mount Vernon were governed by clock time, and the slumbers of Fisher Jack might occasion inconvenience, for the cook required the fish at a certain hour, so that they might be served smoking hot precisely at 3. At times he would go to the river bank and make the accustomed signals, and meet with no response. The old fisherman would be quietly reposing in his canoe, rocked by the gentle undulations of the stream, and dreaming, no doubt, of events long time ago. The importunate master of the kitchen, grown ferocious by delay, would now rush up and down the water's edge, and, by dint of loud shouting, cause the canoe to turn its prow to the shore. Father Jack, indignant at its being supposed he was asleep at his post, would rate those present on the landing. "What you all make such a devil of a noise for, eh? I wouldn't sleep, only noddin'." The establishment of Mount Vernon employed a perfect army of domestics. Yet to each one was assigned special duties, and from each one strict performance was required. There was no confusion where there was order, and the affairs of this estate, embracing thousands of acres and hundreds of dependents, were conducted with as much ease, method, and regularity as the affairs of a homestead of average size. Mrs. Washington was an accomplished housewife of the olden time, and she gave constant attention to all matters of her household, and by her skill and management greatly contributed to the comfort and entertainment of the guests who enjoyed the hospitality of her home. The best charities of life were gathered around Washington in the last days at Mount Vernon. The love and veneration of a whole people for his illustrious services, his generous and untiring labors in the cause of public utility, his kindly demeanor to his family circle, his friends, and numerous dependents, his courteous and cordial hospitality to his guests, many of them strangers from far distant lands, these charities, all of which sprang from the heart, were the ornament of his declining years, and granted the most sublime scene in nature, when human greatness reposes upon human happiness. On the morning of the 17th of December, 1799, the General was engaged in making some improvements in the front of Mount Vernon. As was usual with him, he carried his own compass, noted his observations, and marked out the ground. The day became rainy, with sleet, and the improver remained so long exposed to the inclemency of the weather as to be considerably wetted before his return to the house. About 1 o'clock he was seized with chillness and nausea, but having changed his clothes, he sat down to his indoor work. At night, on joining his family circle, he complained of a slight indisposition. Upon the night of the following day, having borne acute suffering with composure and fortitude, he died. In person, Washington was unique. He looked like no one else. To a stature lofty and commanding, he united a form of the manliest proportions, and a dignified, graceful, and imposing carriage. In the prime of life he stood 6 feet 2 inches. From the period of the Revolution there was an evident bending in his frame, so passing straight before, but the stoop came from the cares and toils of that ardorous contest, rather than from years. For his step was firm, his appearance noble and impressive long after the time when the physical properties of men are supposed to wane. A majestic height was met by corresponding breadth and firmness. His whole person was so cast in nature's finest mould as to resemble an ancient statue, all of whose parts unite to the perfection of the whole. But, with all its developments of muscular power, Washington's form had no look of bulkiness, and so harmonious were its proportions that he did not appear so tall as his portraits have represented. He was rather spare than full during his whole life. The strength of Washington's arm was shown on several occasions. He threw a stone from the bed of the stream to the top of the Natural Bridge, Virginia, and another stone across the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg. The stone was said to be a piece of slate about the size of $1, with which he spanned the bold river, and it took the ground at least 30 yards on the other side. Many have since tried this feat, but none have cleared the water. In 1772, some young men were contending at Mount Vernon in the exercise of pitching the bar. The colonel looked on for a time, then, grasping the missile in his master hand, he whirled the iron through the air, and it fell far beyond any of its former limits. "You see, young gentlemen," said the chief with a smile, "that my arm yet retains some portion of my early vigor." He was then in his 40th year, and probably in the fullness of his physical powers. Those powers became rather mellowed than decayed by time, for his age was like lusty winter, frosty yet kindly, and up to his 68th year he mounted a horse with surprising agility and rode with ease and grace. Ricketts, the celebrated equestrian, used to say, "I delight to see the general ride, and make it a point to fall in with him when I hear he is out on horseback. His seat is so firm, his management so easy and graceful, that I, who am an instructor in horsemanship, would go to him and learn to ride." In his latter days, the general, desirous of riding pleasantly, procured from the north 2 horses of a breed for bearing the saddle. They were well to look at and pleasantly gaited under the saddle, but also scary, and therefore unfitted for the service of one who liked to ride quietly on his farm, occasionally dismounting and walking in his fields to inspect improvements. From one of these horses the general sustained a fall, probably the only fall he ever had from a horse in his life. It was upon a November evening, and he was returning from Alexandria to Mount Vernon with 3 friends and a groom. Having halted a few moments, he dismounted, and, upon rising in his stirrups again, the horse, alarmed at the glare from a fire near the roadside, sprang from under his rider, who came heavily to the ground. His friends rushed to give him assistance, thinking him hurt, but the vigorous old man was upon his feet again, brushing the dust from his clothes, and after thanking those who came to his aid, said that he had had a very complete tumble, and that it was owing to a cause no horseman could well avoid or control, that he was only poised in his stirrup and had not yet gained his saddle when the scary animal sprang from under him. Bred in the vigorous school of frontier warfare, the earth for his bed, his canopy the heavens, Washington excelled the hunter and woodsman in their athletic habits and in those trials of manhood which filled the hardy days of his early life. He was amazingly swift of foot, and could climb steep mountains seemingly without effort. Indeed, in all the tests of his great physical powers he appeared to make little effort. When he overthrew the strong man of Virginia in wrestling, upon a day when many of the finest athletes were engaged in the contest, he had retired to the shade of a tree, intent upon the reading of a book. It was only after the champion of the games strode through the ring, calling for nobler antagonists, and taunting the reader with the fear that he would be thrown, that Washington closed his book. Without taking off his coat, he calmly observed that fear did not enter his make-up. Then, grappling with the champion, he hurled him to the ground. "In Washington's lion-like grasp," said the vanquished wrestler, "I became powerless, and went down with a force that seemed to jar the very marrow in my bones." The victor, regardless of the shouts at his success, leisurely retired to his shade, and again took up his book. Washington's powers were chiefly in his limbs. His frame was of equal breadth from the shoulders to the hips. His chest was not prominent, but rather hollow in the center. He never entirely recovered from a pulmonary affection from which he suffered in early life. His frame showed an extraordinary development of bone and muscle. His joints were large, as were his feet, and could a cast of his hand have been preserved, it would be ascribed to a being of a fabulous age. Lafayette said, "I never saw any human being with so large a hand as the general's." Of the awe and reverence which the presence of Washington inspired, we have many records. "I stood," says one writer, "before the door of the Hall of Congress in Philadelphia when the carriage of the President drew up. It was a white coach, or rather of a light cream color, painted on the panels with beautiful groups representing the 4 seasons. As Washington alighted, and, ascending the steps, paused on the platform, he was preceded by 2 gentlemen bearing large white wands, who kept back the eager crowd that pressed on every side. At that moment I stood so near I might have touched his clothes, but I should as soon have thought of touching an electric battery. I was penetrated with deepest awe, nor was this the feeling of the schoolboy I then was. It pervaded, I believe, every human being that approached Washington, and I have been told that even in his social hours this feeling in those who shared them never suffered intermission. I saw him 100 times afterward, but never with any other than the same feeling. The Almighty, who raised up for our hour of need a man so peculiarly prepared for its whole dread responsibility, seems to have put a stamp of sacredness upon his instrument. The first sight of the man struck the eye with involuntary homage, and prepared everything around him to obey. At the time I speak of, he stood in profound silence, and had the statue-like air which mental greatness alone can bestow. As he turned to enter the building, and was ascending the staircase to the Congressional Hall, I glided along unseen almost under the cover of the skirts of his dress, and entered into the lobby of the House which was in session to receive him. At Washington's entrance there was a most profound silence. House, lobbies, gallery, all were wrapped in deepest attention, and the souls of the entire assemblage seemed peering from their eyes as the noble figure deliberately and unaffectedly advanced up the broad aisle of the hall between ranks of standing senators and members, and slowly ascended the steps leading to the Speaker's chair. The President, having seated himself, remained in silence, and the members took their seats, waiting for the speech. No house of worship was ever more profoundly still than that large and crowded chamber. Washington was dressed precisely as Stuart has painted him, in full-length portrait, in a full suit of the richest black velvet, with diamond knee-buckles and square silver buckles set upon shoes japanned with the most scrupulous neatness, black silk stockings, his shirt ruffled at the breast and waist, a light dress-sword, his hair profusely powdered, fully dressed so as to project at the sides, and gathered behind in a silk bag ornamented with a large rose of black ribbon. He held his cocked hat, which had a large black cockade on one side of it, in his hand as he advanced towards the chair, and when seated, laid it upon the table. At length, thrusting his hand within the side of his coat, he drew forth a roll of manuscript, which he opened, and, rising, read in a rich, deep, full, sonorous voice his opening address to Congress. His enunciation was deliberate, justly emphasized, very distinct, and accompanied with an air of deep solemnity, as being the utterance of a mind conscious of the whole responsibility of its position, but not oppressed by it. There was ever about the man something which impressed one with the conviction that he was exactly and fully equal to what he had to do. He was never hurried, never negligent, but seemed ever prepared for the occasion, be it what it might. In his study, in his parlor, at a levee, before Congress, at the head of an army, he seemed ever to be just what the situation required. He possessed, in a degree never equaled by any human being I ever saw, the strongest, most ever-present sense of propriety. In the early part of Washington's administration, great complaints were made by political opponents of the aristocratic and royal demeanor of the President. Particularly, these complaints were about the manner of his receiving visitors. In a letter, Washington gave account of the origin of his levees. Before the custom was established, he wrote, which now accommodates foreign characters, strangers, and others, who, from motives of curiosity, respect for the chief magistrate, or other cause, are induced to call upon me. I was unable to attend to any business whatever, for gentlemen, consulting their own convenience rather than mine, were calling after the time I rose from breakfast, and often before, until I sat down to dinner. This, as I resolved not to neglect my public duties, reduced me to the choice of one of these alternatives, either to refuse visits altogether, or to appropriate a time for the reception of them. To please everybody was impossible. I, therefore, adopted that line of conduct which combined public advantage with private convenience. These visits are optional. They are made without invitation. Between the hours of 3 and 4 every Tuesday, I am prepared to receive them. Gentlemen, often in great numbers, come and go, chat with each other, and act as they please. A porter shows them into the room, and they retire from it when they choose, without ceremony. At their first entrance, they salute me, and I them, and as many as I can talk to. An English gentleman, after visiting President Washington, wrote, "There was a commanding air in his appearance which excited respect, and forbade too great a freedom toward him, independently of that species of awe which is always felt in the moral influence of a great character. In every movement, too, there was a polite gracefulness equal to any met with in the most polished individuals of Europe. and his smile was extraordinarily attractive. It struck me no man could be better formed for command. A stature of 6 feet, a robust but well-proportioned frame, calculated to stand fatigue, without the heaviness which generally attends great muscular strength and abates active exertion, displayed bodily power of no mean standard. A light eye and full, the very eye of genius and reflection. His nose appeared thick, and though it befitted his other features, was too coarsely and strongly formed to be the handsomest of its class. His mouth was like no other I ever saw, the lips firm, and the under jaw seeming to grasp the upper with force, as if its muscles were in full action when he sat still. Such Washington appeared to those who saw and knew him. Such he remains in our vision. His memory is held by us in undying honor. Not only his memory alone, but also the memory of his associates in the struggle for American independence. Homage we should have in our hearts for those patriots and heroes and sages who, with humble means, raised their native land, now our native land, from the depths of dependence, and made it a free nation. And especially for Washington, who presided over the nation's course at the beginning of the great experiment in self-government, and after an unexampled career in the service of freedom and our humankind, with no dimming of august fame, died calmly at Mount Vernon, the father of his country. End of section 21.
Section 22 of Heroes Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Giordano. Heroes Every Child Should Know. Edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie. Section 22. Robert E. Lee. From Letters and Recollections of General Lee, by Captain Robert E. Lee. A Boy's Impressions. The first vivid recollection I have of my father is his arrival in Arlington, after his return from the Mexican War. I can remember some events of which he seemed a part, when we lived at Fort Hamilton, New York, about 1846. But they are more like dreams, very indistinct and disconnected. Naturally so, for I was at that time about 3 years old. But the day of his return to Arlington, after an absence of more than 2 years, I've always remembered. I had a frock or blouse of some light wash material, probably cotton, a blue ground dotted over with white diamond figures. Of this I was very proud, and wanted to wear it on this important occasion. Eliza, my mammy, objecting, we had a contest, and I won. Clothed in this, my very best, and with my hair freshly curled in long golden ringlets, I went down into the large hall where the whole household was assembled, eagerly greeting my father, who had just arrived on horseback from Washington, having missed in some way the carriage which had been sent for him. There was visiting us at this time Mrs. Lippett, a friend of my mother's, with her little boy, Armistead, about my age and size, also with long curls. Whether he wore as handsome a suit as mine I cannot remember, but he and I were left together in the background, feeling rather frightened and awed. After a moment's greeting to those surrounding him, my father pushed through the crowd, exclaiming, "Where is my little boy?" He then took up in his arms and kissed, not me his own child, in his best frock with clean face and well-arranged curls, but my little playmate, Armistead. I remember nothing more of any circumstances connected with that time, save that I was shocked and humiliated. I have no doubt that he was at once informed of his mistake, and made ample amends to me.
A letter from my father to his brother, Captain S.S. Lee, United States Navy, dated Arlington, June 30th, 1848, tells of his coming home. Here I am once again, my dear Smith, perfectly surrounded by Mary and her precious children, who seem to devote themselves to staring at the furrows in my face and the white hairs in my head. It is not surprising that I am hardly recognizable to some of the young eyes around me, and perfectly unknown to the youngest. But some of the older ones gaze with astonishment and wonder at me, and seem at a loss to reconcile what they see and what was pictured in their imaginations. I find them, too, much grown and all well, and I have much cause for thankfulness and gratitude to that good God who has once more united us. My next recollection of my father is in Baltimore, while we were on a visit to his sister, Mrs. Marshall, the wife of Judge Marshall. I remember being down on the wharves, where my father had taken me to see the landing of a mustang pony which he had gotten for me in Mexico, and which had been shipped from Vera Cruz to Baltimore in a sailing vessel. I was all eyes for the pony, and a very miserable, sad-looking object he was. From his long voyage, cramped quarters, and unavoidable lack of grooming, he was rather a disappointment to me, but I soon got over all that. As I grew older, and was able to ride and appreciate him, he became the joy and pride of my life. I was taught to ride on him by Jim Connolly, the faithful Irish servant of my father, who had been with him in Mexico. Jim used often to tell me, in his quizzical way, that he and Santa Anna, the pony's name, were the first men on the walls of Chapultepec. This pony was pure white, 5 years old, and about 14 hands high. For his inches, he was as good a horse as I ever have seen. While we lived in Baltimore, he and Grace Darling, my father's favorite mare, were members of our family. Grace Darling was a chestnut of fine size and of great power, which he had bought in Texas on his way out to Mexico, her owner having died on the march out. She was with him during the entire campaign, and was shot 7 times. At least, as a little fellow, I used to brag about that number of bullets being in her, and since I could point out the scars of each one, I presume it was so. My father was very much attached and proud of her, always petting her and talking to her in a loving way, when he rode her or went to see her in her stall. Of her he wrote on his return home: "I only arrived yesterday, after a long journey up the Mississippi, which route I was induced to take, for the better accommodation of my horse, as I wished to spare her as much annoyance and fatigue as possible, she already having undergone so much suffering in my service. I landed her at Wheeling, and left her to come over with Jim." Santa Anna was found lying cold and dead in the Park of Arlington one morning in the winter of '60–61. Grace Darling was taken in the spring of '62 from the White House. Footnote: my brother's place on the Pamunkey River, where the mare had been sent for safekeeping, by some Federal quartermaster, when McClellan occupied that place as his base of supplies during his attack on Richmond. When we lived in Baltimore, I was greatly struck one day by hearing 2 ladies who were visiting us saying, "Everybody and everything, his family, his friends, his horse, and his dog, loves Colonel Lee." The dog referred to was a black and tan terrier named Speck, very bright and intelligent, and really a member of the family, respected and beloved by ourselves, and well known to all who knew us. My father picked up its mother in the Narrows, while crossing from Fort Hamilton to the fortifications opposite on Staten Island. She had doubtless fallen overboard from some passing vessel, and had drifted out of sight before her absence had been discovered. He rescued her and took her home, where she was welcomed by his children and made much of. She was a handsome little thing, with cropped ears and a short tail. My father named her Dart. She was a fine ratter, and with the assistance of a Maltese cat, Also a member of the family, the many rats which infested the house and stables were driven away or destroyed. She and the cat were fed out of the same plate, but Dart was not allowed to begin the meal until the cat had finished. Speck was born at Fort Hamilton, and was the joy of us children, our pet and companion. My father would not allow his tail and ears to be cropped. When he grew up, he accompanied us everywhere, and was in the habit of going into church with the family. As some of the little ones allowed their devotions to be disturbed by Speck's presence, my father determined to leave him at home on those occasions. So the next Sunday morning he was sent up to the front room of the second story. After the family had left for church, he contented himself for a while looking out of the window, which was open, it being summer-time. Presently impatience overcame his judgment, and he jumped to the ground, landed safely notwithstanding the distance, joined the family just as they reached the church, and went in with them as usual, much to the joy of the children. After that he was allowed to go to church whenever he wished. My father was very proud of him, and loved to talk to him and about him as if he were really one of us. In a letter to my mother, dated Fort Hamilton, January 18, 1846, when she and her children were on a visit to Arlington, he thus speaks of him: "I am very solitary, and my only companion is my dog and cats. But Speck has become so jealous now that he will hardly let me look at the cats. He seems to be afraid that I am going off from him, and never lets me stir without him, lies down in the office from 8 to 4 without moving, and turns himself before the fire as the side from it becomes cold. I catch him sometimes sitting up, looking at me so intently that I am for a moment startled." In a letter from Mexico, written a year later, December 25, 1846, to my mother, he says: "Can't you cure poor Speck? Cheer him up, take him to walk with you, and tell the children to cheer him up?" In another letter from Mexico to his eldest boy, just after the capture of Vera Cruz, he sends this message to Speck: "Tell him I wish he was here with me. He would have been of great service in telling me when I was coming upon the Mexicans. When I was reconnoitering around Vera Cruz, their dogs frequently told me by barking when I was approaching them too nearly." When he returned to Arlington from Mexico, Speck was the first to recognize him, and the extravagance of his demonstrations of delight left no doubt that he knew at once his kind master and loving friend, though he had been absent 3 years. Some time during our residence in Baltimore, Speck disappeared, and we never knew his fate. From that early time I began to be impressed with my father's character, as compared with other men. Every member of the household respected, revered, and loved him as a matter of course. But it began to dawn on me that everyone else with whom I was thrown held him high in their regard. At 45 years of age he was active, strong, and as handsome as he had ever been. I never remember his being ill. I presume he was indisposed at times, but no impressions of that kind remain. He was always bright and gay with us little folk, romping, playing, and joking with us. With the older children he was just as companionable, and I have seen him join my elder brothers and their friends when they would try their powers at a high jump put up in our yard. The 2 younger children he petted a great deal, and our greatest treat was to get into his bed in the morning and lie close to him, listening while he talked to us in his bright, entertaining way. This custom we kept up until I was 10 years old and over. Although he was so joyous and familiar with us, he was very firm in all proper occasions, never indulged us in anything that was not good for us, and exacted the most implicit obedience. I always knew that it was impossible to disobey my father. I felt it in me, I never thought why, but was perfectly sure when he gave an order that it had to be obeyed. My mother I could sometimes circumvent, and at times took liberties with her orders, construing them to suit myself, but exact obedience to every mandate of my father was a part of my life, and being at that time. In January 1849, Captain Lee was one of a board of army officers appointed to examine the coasts of Florida and its defenses, and to recommend locations for new fortifications. In April he was assigned to the duty of the construction of Fort Carroll, in the Patapsco River, below Baltimore. He was there, I think, for 3 years, and lived in a house on Madison Street, 3 doors above Biddle. I used to go down with him to the fort quite often. We went to the wharf in a bus, and there we were met by a boat with 2 oarsmen, who rowed us down to Settler's Point, where I was generally left under the care of the people who lived there, while my father went over to the fort, a short distance out in the river. These days were very happy ones for me. The wharves, the shipping, the river, the boat and oarsmen, and the country dinner we had at the house at Sellers Point, all made a strong impression on me. But above all I remember my father, his gentle, loving care for me, his bright talk, his stories, his maxims and teachings. I was very proud of him, and of the evident respect for and trust in him every one showed. These impressions, obtained at that time, have never left me. He was a great favorite in Baltimore, as he was everywhere, especially with ladies and little children. When he and my mother went out in the evening to some entertainment, we were often allowed to sit up and see them off. My father, as I remember, always in full uniform, always ready and waiting for my mother, who was generally late. He would then chide her gently, in a playful way, and with a bright smile. He would then bid us good-bye, and I would go to sleep with his beautiful picture on my mind, the golden epaulets and all, chiefly the epaulets. In Baltimore I went to my first school, that of a Mr. Rollins on Mulberry Street, and I remember how interested my father was in my studies, my failures, and my little triumphs. Indeed, he was so always, as long as I was at school and college, and I only wish that all of the kind, sensible, useful letters he wrote me had been preserved. My memory as to the move from Baltimore, which occurred in 1852, is very dim. I think the family went to Arlington to remain until my father had arranged for our removal to the new home at West Point. My recollection of my father as superintendent of the West Point Military Academy is much more distinct. He lived in the house, which is still occupied by the superintendent. It was built of stone, large and roomy, with gardens, stables, and pasture lots. We, the 2 youngest children, enjoyed it all. Grace Darling and Santa Anna were with us, and many a fine ride did I have with my father in the afternoons, when, released from his office, he would mount his old mare, and with Santa Anna carrying me by his side, take a 5 or 10 mile trot. Though the pony cantered delightfully, he would keep me up in a trot, saying playfully that the hammering I sustained was good for me. We rode the dragoon seat, no posting, and until I became accustomed to it, I used to be very tired by the time I got back. My father was the most punctual man I ever knew. He was always ready for family prayers, for meals, and met every engagement, social or business, at the moment. He expected all of us to be the same, and taught us the use and necessity of forming such habits for the convenience of all concerned. I never knew him late for Sunday service at the post chapel. He used to appear some minutes before the rest of us, in uniform, jokingly rallying my mother for being late, and for forgetting something at the last moment. When he could wait no longer for her, he would say that he was off, and would march along to church by himself, or with any of the children who were ready. There he sat very straight, well up in the middle aisle, and, as I remember, always became very sleepy, and sometimes even took a little nap during the sermon. At that time, this drowsiness of my father's was something awful to me, inexplicable. I knew it was very hard for me to keep awake, and frequently I did not. But why he, who to my mind could do everything that was right without any effort, should sometimes be overcome, I could not understand, and did not try to do so. It was against the rules that the cadets should go beyond certain limits without permission. Of course they did go sometimes, and when caught were given quite a number of demerits. My father was riding one afternoon with me, and, while rounding a turn in the mountain road with a deep woody ravine on one side, we came suddenly upon 3 cadets far beyond the limits. They immediately leaped over a low wall on the side of the road, and disappeared from our view. We rode on for a minute in silence. Then my father said, "Did you know those young men? But no, if you did, don't say so. I wish boys would do what is right. It would be so much easier for all parties." He knew he would have to report them, but, not being sure of who they were, I presume he wished to give them the benefit of the doubt. At any rate, I never heard any more about it. One of the three asked me next day if my father had recognized them, and I told him what had occurred. By this time I had become old enough to have a room to myself, and, to encourage me in being useful and practical, my father made me attend to it, just as the cadets had to do with their quarters in barracks and in camp. He at first even went through the form of inspecting it, to see if I had performed my duty properly, and I think I enjoyed this until the novelty wore off. However, I was kept at it, becoming in time very proficient, and the knowledge so acquired has been of great use to me all through life. My father always encouraged me in every healthy outdoor exercise and sport. He taught me to ride, constantly giving me minute instructions, with the reasons for them. He gave me my first sled, and sometimes used to come out where we boys were coasting to look on. He gave me my first pair of skates, and placed me in the care of a trustworthy person, inquiring regularly how I progressed. It was the same with swimming, which he was very anxious I should learn in a proper manner. Professor Bailey had a son about my age, now himself a professor of Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island, who became my great chum. I took my first lesson in the water with him, under the direction and supervision of his father. My father inquired constantly how I was getting along, and made me describe exactly my method and stroke, explaining to me what he considered the best way to swim, and the reasons therefor. I went to a day school at West Point, and had always a sympathetic helper in my father. Often he would come into my room where I studied at night, and, sitting down by me, would show me how to overcome a hard sentence in my Latin reader, or a difficult sum in arithmetic, not by giving me the translation of the troublesome sentence, or the answer to the sum, but by showing me, step by step, the way to the right solutions. He was very patient, very loving, very good to me, and I remember trying my best to please him in my studies. When I was able to bring home a good report from my teacher, he was greatly pleased, and showed it in his eye and voice, but he always insisted that I should get the maximum, that he would never be perfectly satisfied with less. That I did sometimes win it, deservedly, I knew was due to his judicious and wise method of exciting my ambition and perseverance. I have endeavored to show how fond my father was of his children, and as the best picture I can offer of his loving, tender devotion to us all, I give here a letter from him, written about this time to one of his daughters, who was staying with our grandmother, Mrs. Custis, at Arlington. West Point, February 25, 1853. My precious Annie, I take advantage of your gracious permission to write to you, and there is no telling how far my feelings might carry me were I not limited by the conveyance furnished by the Mims, footnote, his pet name for my mother, letter, which lies before me, and which must, the Mims says so, go in this morning's mail. But my limited time does not diminish my affection for you, Annie, nor prevent my thinking of you and wishing for you. I long to see you through the dilatory nights. At dawn when I rise, and all day, my thoughts revert to you in expressions that you cannot hear, or I repeat. I hope you will always appear to me as you are now painted on my heart, and that you will endeavor to improve and so conduct yourself as to make you happy and me joyful all our lives. Diligent and earnest attention to all your duties can only accomplish this. I am told you are growing very tall, and I hope very straight. I do not know what the cadets will say if the superintendent's children do not practice what he demands of them. They will naturally say he had better attend to his own before he corrects other people's children, and as he permits his to stoop it is hard he will not allow them. You and Agnes, footnote, his third daughter, must not, therefore, bring me into discredit with my young friends, or give them reason to think that I require more of them than of my own. I presume your mother has told all about this, our neighbors and our affairs. And indeed she may have done that and not said much either, so far as I know. But we are all well and have much to be grateful for. To-morrow we anticipate the pleasure of your brother's his son, Curtis, company, which is always a source of pleasure to us. It is the only time we see him, except when the corps come under my view at some of their exercises, when my eye is sure to distinguish him among his comrades, and follow him over the plain. Give much love to your dear grandmother, grandfather, Agnes, Miss Sue, Lucretia, and all his friends, including the servants. Write sometimes, and think always of your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. In a letter to my mother, written many years previous to this, he says, I pray God to watch over and direct our efforts in guarding our dear little son. Oh, what pleasure I lose in being separated from my children! Nothing can compensate me for that. In another letter of about the same time, you do not know how much I have missed you and the children, my dear Mary. To be alone in a crowd is very solitary. In the woods I feel sympathy with the trees and birds, in whose company I take delight, but experience no pleasure in a strange crowd. I hope you are all well, and will continue so, and therefore must again urge you to be very prudent and careful of those dear children. If I could only get a squeeze at that little fellow, turning up his sweet mouth to Kees Baba, you must not let him run wild in my absence, and will have to exercise firm authority over all of them. This will not require severity or even strictness, but constant attention in an unwavering course. Mildness and forbearance will strengthen their affection for you, while it will maintain your control over them. In a letter to one of his sons he writes as follows: I cannot go to bed, my dear son, without writing you a few lines to thank you for your letter, which gave me great pleasure. You and Custis must take great care of your kind mother and dear sisters when your father is dead. To do that you must learn to be good, be true, kind, and generous, and pray earnestly to God to enable you to keep his commandments and walk in the same all the days of your life. I hope to come on soon to see that little baby you have got to show me. You must give her a kiss for me, and one to all the children, to your mother and grandmother. The expression of such sentiments as these was common to my father all through his life, and to show that it was all children and not his own little folk alone that charmed and fascinated him, I quote from a letter to my mother. I saw a number of little girls all dressed up in their white frocks and pantalettes, their hair plaited and tied up with ribbons, running and chasing each other in all directions. I counted 23 nearly the same size. As I drew up my horse to admire the spectacle, a man appeared at the door with the 24th in his arms. "My friend," said I, "are all these your children?" "Yes," he said, "and there are 9 more in the house, and this is the youngest." Upon further inquiry, however, I found that they were only temporarily his, and that they were invited to a party at his house. He said, however, he had been admiring them before I came up, and just wished that he had $1,000,000, and that they were all his in reality. I do not think the eldest exceeded 7 or 8 years old. It was the prettiest sight I have seen in the West, and perhaps in my life. As superintendent of the military academy at West Point, my father had to entertain a good deal, and I remember well how handsome and grand he looked in uniform, how genial and bright, how considerate of everybody's comfort of mind and body. He was always a great favorite with the ladies, especially the young ones. His fine presence, his gentle, courteous manners and kindly smile put them at once at ease with them. Among the cadets at this time were my eldest brother Custis, who graduated first in his class in 1854, and my father's nephew, Fitz Lee, a third-classman, besides other relatives and friends. Saturday being a half-holiday for the cadets, it was the custom for all social events in which they were to take part to be placed on that afternoon or evening. Nearly every Saturday a number of these young men were invited to our house to tea, or supper, for it was a good, substantial meal. The misery of some of these lads, owing to embarrassment, possibly from awe of the superintendent, was pitiable and evident even to me, a boy of 10 or 12 years old. But as soon as my father got command, as it were, of the situation, one could see how quickly most of them were put at their ease. He would address himself to the task of making them feel comfortable and at home, and his genial manner and pleasant ways at once succeeded. In the spring of 1853, my grandmother, Mrs. Custis, died. This was the first death in our immediate family. She was very dear to us, and was admired, esteemed, and loved by all who had ever known her. Bishop Meade of Virginia writes of her: Mrs. Mary Custis of Arlington, the wife of Mr. Washington Custis, grandson of Mrs. General Washington, was a daughter of Mr. William Fitzhugh of Chatham. Scarcely is there a Christian lady in our land more honored than she was, and none more loved and esteemed. For good sense, prudence, sincerity, benevolence, unaffected piety, disinterested zeal in every good work, deep humanity and retiring modesty, for all the virtues which adorn the wife, the mother, and the friend, I never knew her superior. In a letter written to my mother soon after this sad event, my father says, "May God give you strength to enable you to bear and say, 'His will be done.' She has gone from all trouble, care, and sorrow to a holy immortality, there to rejoice and praise forever the God and Saviour she so long and truly served. Let that be our comfort and that our consolation. May our death be like hers, and may we meet in happiness in heaven." In another letter, about the same time, he writes, "She was to me all that a mother could be, and I yield to none in admiration for her character, love for her virtues, and veneration for her memory." At this time my father's family and friends persuaded him to allow R.S. Weir, professor of painting and drawing at the Academy, to paint his portrait. As far as I remember, there was only one sitting, and the artist had to finish it from memory or from the glimpses he obtained of his subject in the regular course of their daily lives at the Point. This picture shows my father in the undress uniform of a colonel of engineers. Footnote: his appointment of superintendent of the military academy earned with it the temporary rank of colonel of engineers. And many think it a very good likeness. To me, the expression of strength peculiar to his face is wanting, and the mouth fails to portray that sweetness of disposition so characteristic of his countenance. Still, it was like him at that time. My father never could bear to have his picture taken, and there are no such likenesses of him that really give his sweet expression. Sitting for a picture was such a serious business with him that he never could look pleasant. In 1855 my father was appointed to the lieutenant colonelcy of the 2nd Cavalry, one of the 2 regiments just raised. He left West Point to enter upon his new duties, and his family went to Arlington to live. During the fall and winter of 1855 and '56, the 2nd Cavalry was recruited and organized at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, under the direction of Colonel Lee, and in the following spring was marched to western Texas, where it was assigned the duty of protecting the settlers in that wild country. I did not see my father again until he came to my mother at Arlington after the death of her father, G.W.P. Custis, in October, 1857. He took charge of my mother's estate after her father's death, and commenced at once to put it in order, not an easy task, as it consisted of several plantations and many negroes. I was at a boarding school, after the family returned to Arlington, and saw my father only during the holidays, if he happened to be at home. He was always fond of farming, and took great interest in the improvements he immediately began at Arlington relating to the cultivation of the farm, to the buildings, roads, fences, fields, and stock, so that in a very short time the appearance of everything on the estate was improved. He often said that he longed for the time when he could have a farm of his own, where he could end his days in quiet and peace, interested in the care and improvement of his own land. This idea was always with him. In a letter to his son, written in July, 1865, referring to some proposed indictments of prominent Confederates, he says, "As soon as I can ascertain their intention toward me, if not prevented, I shall endeavor to procure some humble but quiet abode for your mother and sisters, where I hope they can be happy. As I before said, I want to get in some grass country, where the natural product of the land will do much for my subsistence." Again, in a letter to his son, dated October 1865, after he had accepted the presidency of Washington College, Lexington, Virginia. I should have selected a more quiet life and a more retired abode than Lexington. I should have preferred a small farm, where I could have earned my daily bread. About this time I was given a gun of my own, and was allowed to go shooting by myself. My father, to give me an incentive, offered a reward for every crow scalp I could bring him, and, in order that I might get to work at once, advanced a small sum with which to buy powder and shot, the sum to be returned to him out of the first scalps obtained. My industry and zeal were great, my hopes high, and by good luck I did succeed in bagging 2 crows about the second time I went out. I showed them with great pride to my father, intimating that I should shortly be able to return him his loan, and that he must be prepared to hand over to me very soon further rewards for my skill. His eyes twinkled, and his smile showed that he had strong doubts of my making an income by killing crows, and he was right, for I never killed another, though I tried hard and long. I saw but little of my father after we left West Point. He went to Texas, as I have stated, in '55, and remained until the fall of '57, the time of my grandfather's death. He was then at Arlington about a year. Returning to his regiment, he remained in Texas until the autumn of '59, when he came again to Arlington, having applied for leave in order to finish the settling of my grandfather's estate. During this visit he was selected by the Secretary of War to suppress the famous John Brown raid, and was sent to Harper's Ferry in command of the United States troops. From his memorandum book the following entries are taken. October 17, 1859. Received orders from the Secretary of War, in person, to repair an evening train to Harper's Ferry. Reached Harper's Ferry at 11 p.m. Posted Marines in the United States Armory. Waited until daylight, as a number of citizens were held as hostages, whose lives were threatened. Tuesday about sunrise, with 12 Marines, under Lieutenant Green, broke in the door of the engine house, secured the insurgents, and relieved the prisoners unhurt. All the insurgents killed or mortally wounded, but 4, John Brown, Stevens, Copy, and Shields. Brown was tried and convicted, and sentenced to be hanged on December 2, 1859. Colonel Lee writes as follows to his wife: Harper's Ferry, December 1, 1859. I arrived here, dearest Mary, yesterday about noon, with 4 companies from Fort Monroe, and was busy all the evening and night getting accommodation for the men, etc., and posting sentinels and pickets to ensure timely notice of the approach of the enemy. The night has passed off quietly. The feelings of the community seem to be calmed down, and I have been received with every kindness. Mr. Fry is among the officers from Old Point. There are several young men, former acquaintance of ours, as cadets, Mr. Bingham of Custis's class, Sam Cooper, etc. But the senior officers I never met before, except Captain Howell, the friend of our cousin Harriet R. I presume we are fixed here till after the 16th. Tomorrow will probably be the last of Captain Brown. There will be less interest for the others, but still I think the troops will not be withdrawn till they are similarly disposed of. Custis will have informed you that I had to go to Baltimore the evening that I left you, to make arrangements for the transportation for the troops. This morning I was introduced to Mrs. Brown, who, with a Mrs. Tyndall and a Mr. and Mrs. McKim, all from Philadelphia, had come on to have a last interview with her husband. As it is a matter over which I have no control, I referred them to General Taliaferro. Footnote: General William B. Taliaferro, commanding Virginia troops at Harper's Ferry. You must write to me at this place. I hope you are all well. Give love to everybody. Tell Smith, footnote, Sidney Smith Lee, of the United States Navy, his brother, that no charming women have insisted on taking care of me as they are always doing of him. I am left to my own resources. I will write you again soon, and will always be truly and affectionately yours, R. E. Lee. Mrs. M. C. Lee. In February, 1860, he was ordered to take command of the Department of Texas. There he remained a year. The first months after his arrival were spent in the vain pursuit of the famous brigand, Cortinez, who was continually stealing across the Rio Grande, burning the homes, driving off the stock of the ranchmen, and then retreating into Mexico. The summer months he spent in San Antonio, and while there interested himself with the good people of that town in building an Episcopal church, for which he contributed largely. End of Section 22. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 23 of Heroes Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jill Engle. Heroes Every Child Should Know. Edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie. Section 23. The Youth of Lincoln. Adapted from The True Story of Abraham Lincoln by Elbridge S. Brooks. He was long, he was strong, he was wiry. He was never sick, was always good-natured, never a bully, always a friend of the weak, the small, and the unprotected. He must have been a funny-looking boy. His skin was sallow, and his hair was black. He wore a linsey-woolsey shirt, buckskin breeches, a coonskin cap, and heavy clumps of shoes. He grew so fast that his breeches never came down to the tops of his shoes, and, instead of stockings, you could always see 12 inches of shin bones, sharp, blue, and narrow. He laughed much, was always ready to give and take jokes and hard knocks, had a squeaky, changing voice, a small head, big ears, and was always what Thackeray called a gentleman. Such was Abraham Lincoln at 15. He was never cruel, mean, or unkind. His first composition was on cruelty to animals, written because he had tried to make the other boys stop teasin' terrapins, that is, catching turtles and putting hot coals on their backs just to make them move along lively. He had to work hard at home, for his father would not, and things needed to be attended to if the place was to be kept from dropping to pieces. He became a great reader. He read every book and newspaper he could get hold of, and if he came across anything in his reading that he wished to remember, he would copy it on a shingle, because writing paper was scarce, and either learn it by heart or hide the shingle away until he could get some paper to copy it on. His father thought he read too much. "It will spile him for work," he said. "He don't do half enough about the place as it is now, and books and paper ain't no good." But Abraham, with all his reading, did more work than his father any day. His stepmother, too, took his side, and at last got her husband to let the boy read and study at home. "Abe was a good son to me," she said, many, many years after, "and we took particular care, when he was reading, not to disturb him. We would just let him read on and on till he quit of his own accord." The boy kept a sort of shingle scrapbook. He kept a paper scrapbook, too. Into these he would put whatever he cared to keep: poetry, history, funny sayings, fine passages. He had a scrapbook for his arithmetic sums, too, and one of these is still in existence with this boyish rhyme in a boyish scrawl underneath one of his tables of weights and measures: "Abraham Lincoln is hand and pen, he will be good, but God knows when." God did know when, and that boy, all unconsciously, was working toward the day when his hand and pen were to do more for humanity than any other hand or pen of modern times. Lamps and candle were almost unknown in his home, and Abraham, flat on his stomach, would often do his reading, writing, and ciphering in the firelight, as it flashed and flickered on the big hearth of his log cabin home. An older cousin, John Hanks, who lived for a while with the Lincolns, says that when Abe, as he always called the great president, would come home as a boy from his work, he would go to the cupboard, take a piece of cornbread for his supper, sit down on a chair, stretch out his long legs until they were higher than his head, and read and read and read. "Abe and I," said John Hanks, "worked barefoot, grubbed it, plowed it, mowed and cradled it, plowed corn, gathered corn, and shucked corn, and Abe read constantly whenever he could get a chance." One day Abraham found that a man for whom he sometimes worked owned a copy of Weem's Life of Washington. This was a famous book in its day. Abraham borrowed it at once. When he was not reading it, he put it away on a shelf, a clapboard resting on wooden pins. There was a big crack between the logs behind the shelf, and one rainy day the Life of Washington fell into the crack and was soaked almost into pulp. Old Mr. Crawford, from whom Abraham borrowed the book, was a cross, cranky, and sour old fellow, and when the boy told him of the accident, he said Abraham must work the book out. The boy agreed, and the old farmer kept him so strictly to his promise that he made him pull fodder for the cattle 3 days as payment for the book. And that is the way that Abraham Lincoln bought his first book. For he dried the copy of Weem's Life of Washington and put it in his library. But what boy or girl of today would like to buy books at such a price? This was the boy life of Abraham Lincoln. It was a life of poverty, privation, hard work, little play, and less money. The boy did not love work, but he worked. His father was rough and often harsh and hard to him, and what Abraham learned was by making the most of his spare time. He was inquisitive, active, and hardy, and in his comfortless boyhood he was learning lessons of self-denial, independence, pluck, shrewdness, kindness, and persistence. In the spring of 1830, there was another moving time for the Lincolns. The corn and the cattle, the farm and its hogs were all sold at public vendue, or auction, at low figures. And with all their household goods on a big ironed wagon drawn by 4 oxen, the 3 related families of Hanks, Hall, and Lincoln, 13 in all, pushed on through the mud and across rivers, high from the spring freshets, out of Indiana, into Illinois. Abraham held the gad and guided the oxen. He carried with him also a little stock of pins, needles, threads, and buttons. These he peddled along the way, and at last, after 15 days of slow travel, the emigrants came to the spot picked out for a home. This time it was built on a small bluff on the north fork of the Sangamon River, 10 miles west of the town of Decatur. The usual log house was built. The boys, with the oxen, broke up, or cleared, 15 acres of land, and split enough rails to fence it in. Abraham could swing his broadaxe better than any man or boy in the West. At one stroke he could bury the axe blade to the haft in a log, and he was already famous as an expert rail splitter. By this time his people were settled in their new home. Abraham Lincoln was 21. He was of age. He was a man. By the law of the land he was freed from his father's control. He could shift for himself, and he determined to do so. This did not mean that he disliked his father. It simply meant that he had no intention of following his father's example. Thomas Lincoln demanded all the work and all the wages his son could earn or do, and Abraham felt that he could not have a fair chance to accomplish anything or get ahead in the world if he continued living with this shiftless, never-satisfied, do-nothing man. So he struck out for himself. In the summer of 1830, Abraham left home and hired out on his own account, wherever he could get a job in the new country into which he had come. In that region of big farms and no fences, these latter were needed, and Abraham Lincoln's stalwart arm and well-swung axe came well into play, cutting up logs for fences. He was what was called in that western country a rail splitter. Indeed, one of the first things he did when he struck out for himself was to split 400 rails for every yard of blue jeans necessary to make him a pair of trousers, from which it will be seen that work was easier to get than clothes. He soon became as much of a favorite in Illinois as he had been in Indiana. Other work came to him, and in 1831 he hired out with a man named Offutt to help sail a flatboat down the Mississippi to New Orleans. Mr. Offutt had heard that Abe Lincoln was a good river hand, strong, steady, honest, reliable, accustomed to boating, and that he already made one trip down the river. So he engaged young Lincoln at what seemed to the young rail splitter princely wages, 50 cents a day, and a third share in the $60 which was to be divided among the 3 boatmen at the end of the trip. They built the flatboat at a sawmill near a place called Sangamontown, Abe serving as cook of the camp while the boat was being built. Then, loading the craft with barrel pork, hogs, and corn, they started on their voyage south. At a place called New Salem, the flatboat ran aground, but Lincoln's ingenuity got it off. He rigged up a queer contrivance of his own invention, and lifted the boat off and over the obstruction, while all New Salem stood on the bank, first to criticize and then to applaud. Just what this invention was, I cannot explain, but if you ever go into the patent office at Washington, ask to see Abraham Lincoln's patent for transporting riverboats over snags and shoals. The wooden model is there, for so pleased was Lincoln with the success that he thought seriously of becoming an inventor, and his first design was the patent granted to him in 1849, the idea for which grew out of this successful floating of Offutt's flatboat over the river snags at New Salem 19 years before. Once again he visited New Orleans, returning home as before by steamboat. That voyage is remarkable because it first opened young Lincoln's eyes to the enormity of African slavery. Of course he had seen slaves before, but the sight of a slave sale in the old marketplace of New Orleans seems to have aroused his anger and given him an intense hatred of slaveholding. He himself declared years after that it was that visit to New Orleans that had set him so strongly against slavery. There is a story told by one of his companions that Lincoln looked for a while upon the dreadful scenes of the slave market, and then, turning away, said excitedly, "Come away, boys. If I ever get a chance some day to hit that thing," and he flung his long arm toward the dreadful auction block, "I'll hit it hard." Soon after he returned from his flatboat trip to New Orleans, he had an opportunity to show that he could not and would not stand what is termed foul play. The same Mr. Offutt who had hired Lincoln to be one of his flatboat boys gave him another opportunity for work. Offutt was what is called in the West a hustler. He had lots of great ideas and plans for making money, and among his numerous enterprises was one to open a country store and mill at New Salem, the very same village on the Sangamon where, by his patent invention, Lincoln had lifted the flatboat off the snags. Mr. Offutt had taken a great fancy to Lincoln and offered him a place as clerk in the New Salem store. The young fellow jumped at the chance. It seemed to him quite an improvement on being a farmhand, a flatboatman, or a rail splitter. It was indeed a step upward, for it gave him better opportunities for self-instruction and more chances for getting ahead. Offutt's store was a favorite loafing place for the New Salem boys and young men. Among these were some of the roughest fellows in the settlement. They were known as the Clary Grove Boys, and they were always ready for a fight in which they would, sometimes, prove themselves to be bullies and tormentors. When, therefore, Offutt began to brag about his new clerk, the Clary Grove Boys made fun at him, whereupon the storekeeper cried, "What's that? You can throw him? Well, I reckon not. Abe Lincoln can outrun, outwalk, outwrestle, knock out, and throw down any man in Sangamon County." This was too much for the Clary Grove Boys. They took up Offutt's challenge, and against Abe set up as their champion and best man one Jack Armstrong. All this was done without Lincoln's knowledge. He had no desire to get into a row with anyone, least of all with the bullies who made up the Clary Grove Boys. "I won't do it," he said, when Offutt told him of the proposed wrestling match. "I never tussle and scuffle, and I will not. I don't like this pulling and pulling." "Don't let them call you a coward, Abe," said Offutt. Of course you know what the end would be to such an affair. Nobody likes to be called a coward, especially when he knows he is not one. So at last Lincoln consented to wrestle with Jack Armstrong. They met with all the boys as spectators. They wrestled and tugged and clenched, but without result. Both young fellows were equally matched in strength. "It's no use, Jack," Lincoln at last declared. "Let's quit. You can't throw me, and I can't throw you. That's enough." With that, all Jack's backers began to cry, "Coward!" and urged on the champion to another tussle. Jack Armstrong was now determined to win by fair means or foul. He tried the latter, and, contrary to all rules of wrestling, began to kick and trip, while his supporters stood ready to help, if need be, by breaking in with a regular free fight. This foul play roused the lion in Lincoln. He hated unfairness, and at once resented it. He suddenly put forth his Samson-like strength, grabbed the champion of the Clary Grove Boys by the throat, and lifting him from the ground, held him at arm's length and shook him as a dog shakes a rat. Then he flung him to the ground, and, facing the amazed and yelling crowd, he cried, "You cowards! You know I don't want to fight, but if you try any such games, I'll tackle the whole lot of you. I've won the fight." He had. From that day, no man in all that region dared to tackle young Lincoln, or to taunt him with cowardice, and Jack Armstrong was his devoted friend and admirer. I have told you more, perhaps, of the famous fight than I ought, not because it was a fight, but because it gives you a glimpse of Abraham Lincoln's character. He disliked rows. He was too kind-hearted and good-natured to wish to quarrel with anyone, but he hated unfairness and was enraged at anything like persecution or bullying. If you will look up Shakespeare's play of Hamlet, you will see that Lincoln was ready to act upon the advice that old Polonius gave to his son Laertes. Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but, being in, bear it that the opposer may beware of thee. He became quite a man in that little community. As a clerk, he was obliging and strictly honest. He was the judge and settler of all disputes, and none thought of combating his decisions. He was the village peacemaker. He hated profanity, drunkenness, and unkindness to women. He was feared and respected by all, and even the Clary Grove boys declared at last that he was the cleverest feller that ever broke into the settlement. All the time, too, he was trying to improve himself. He liked to sit around and talk and tell stories just the same as ever, but he saw this was not the way to get on in the world. He worked, whenever he had the chance, outside of his store duties, and once, when trade was dull and hands were short in the clearing, he turned to and split enough logs into rails to make a pen for 1,000 hogs. When he was not at work, he devoted himself to his books. He could read, write, and cipher. This was more education than most men about him possessed. But he hoped some day to go before the public. To do this, he knew he must speak and write correctly. He talked to the village schoolmaster, who advised him to study English grammar. "Well, if I had a grammar," said Lincoln, "I'd begin now. Have you got one?" The schoolmaster had no grammar, but he told Abe of a man 6 miles off who owned one. Thereupon, Lincoln started upon the run to borrow that grammar. He brought it back so quickly that the schoolmaster was astonished. Then he set to work to learn the rules and exceptions. He studied that grammar, stretched full length on the store counter, or under a tree outside the store, or at night before a blazing fire of shavings in the cooper's shop, and soon he had mastered it. He borrowed every book in New Salem. He made the schoolmaster give him lessons in the store. He buttonholed every stranger that came into the place, who looked as if they knew anything, until at last everyone in New Salem was ready to echo Offutt's boast that Abe Lincoln knew more than any man in these United States. One day, in the bottom of an old barrel of trash, he made a splendid find. It was 2 old law books. He read and reread them, got all the sense and argument out of their dry pages, blossomed into a debater, began to dream of being a lawyer, and became so skilled in seeing through and settling knotty questions that, once again, New Salem wondered at this clerk of Offutt's, who was as long of head as of arms and legs, and declared that Abe Lincoln could out-argue any 10 men in the settlement. In all the history of America, there has been no man who started lower and climbed higher than Abraham Lincoln, the backwoods boy. He never slipped back. He always kept going ahead. He broadened his mind, enlarged his outlook, and led his companions rather than let them lead him. He was jolly company, good-natured, kind-hearted, fond of jokes and stories, and a good time generally. But he was the champion of the weak, the friend of the friendless, as true a knight and as full of chivalry as any one of the heroes in armor of whom you read in Ivanhoe or the Talisman. He never cheated, never lied, never took an unfair advantage of anyone. But he was ambitious, strong-willed, a bold fighter, and a tough adversary, a fellow who would never say die, and who, therefore, succeeded. End of section 23. Recording by Jill Engle.
Section 24 of Heroes Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Heroes Every Child Should Know. Edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie. Section 24. Father Damien. Adapted from Father Damien, A Journey from Kashmir to His Home in Hawaii, by Edward Clifford. As we approached Molokai, I found that the slow work of centuries had nearly covered its lava with verdure. At dawn we were opposite Kalaupapa. Two little spired churches, looking precisely alike, caught my eye first, and around them were dotted the white cottages of the lepers. But the sea was too rough for us to land. The waves dashed against the rocks, and the spray rose 50 feet into the air. We went on to Kalawao, but were again disappointed. It was too dangerous to disembark. Finally, it was decided to put off a boat for a rocky point about 1.5 miles distant from the town. Climbing down this point, we saw about 20 lepers, and "There is Father Damien," said our purser. And, slowly moving along the hillside, I saw a dark figure with a large straw hat. He came rather painfully down and sat near the waterside, and we exchanged friendly signals across the waves while my baggage was being got out of the hold, a long business owing to the violence of the sea. At last all was ready, and we went swinging across the waves, and finally chose a fit moment for leaping on shore. Father Damien caught me by the hand, and a hearty welcome shone from his kindly face as he helped me up the rock. He immediately called me by my name, Edward, and said it was, like everything else, a providence, that he had met me at this irregular landing place, for he had expected the ship to stop at Kalaupapa. He was now 49 years old, a thick-set, strongly built man, with black curly hair and short beard turning grey. His countenance must have been handsome, with a full, well-curved mouth and a short straight nose, but he was now a good deal disfigured by leprosy, though not so badly as to make it anything but a pleasure to look at his bright, sensible face. His forehead was swollen and rigid, the eyebrows gone, the nose somewhat sunk, and the ears greatly enlarged. His hands and face looked uneven, with a sort of incipient boils, and his body also showed many signs of the disease, but he assured me that he had felt little or no pain since he had tried Dr. Goto's system of hot baths and Japanese medicine. The bathrooms that have been provided by the government are very nice. A large wooden box of presents from English friends had been unshipped with the Guardian oil. It was, however, so large that Father Damien said it would be impossible for his lepers either to land it from the boat or to carry it to Kalawao, and that it must be returned to the steamer and landed on some voyage when the sea was quieter. But I could not give up the pleasure of his enjoyment in its contents, so after some delay it was forced open in the boat, and the things were handed out one by one across the waves. The lepers all came round with their poor marred faces, and the presents were carried home by them and our two selves. As we ascended the hill on which the village is built, Father Damien showed me on our left the chicken farm. The lepers are justly proud of it, and before many days I had a fine fowl sent me for dinner, which, after a little natural timidity, I ate with thankfulness. On arriving at Kalawao, we speedily found ourselves inside the half-finished church, which was the darling of his heart. Now he enjoyed planning the places where the pictures which I had just brought him should be placed. By the side of this church he showed me the palm tree, under which he lived for some weeks when he first arrived at the settlement in 1873. His own little 4-roomed house almost joins the church. After dinner we went up the little flight of steps which led to Father Damien's balcony. This was shaded by a honeysuckle in blossom. Some of my happiest times at Molokai were spent in this little balcony, sketching him and listening to what he said. The lepers came up to watch my progress, and it was pleasant to see how happy and at home they were. Their poor faces were often swelled and drawn and distorted, with bloodshot goggle eyes. I offered to give a photograph of the picture to his brother in Belgium, but he said perhaps it would be better not to do so, as it might pain him to see how he was disfigured. He looked mournfully at my work. "What an ugly face," he said. "I did not know the disease had made such progress." Looking-glasses are not in great request at Molokai. While I sketched him, he often read his breviary. At other times we talked on subjects that interested us both, especially about the work of the church army, and sometimes I sang hymns to him, among others. "Brief life is here our portion," "Art thou weary, art thou languid," and "Safe home in port." At such times the expression of his face was particularly sweet and tender. One day I asked him if he would like to send a message to Cardinal Manning. He said that it was not for such as he to send a message to so great a dignitary, but after a moment's hesitation he added, "I send my humble respects and thanks." I need scarcely say that he gave himself no airs of martyr, saint, or hero. A humbler man I never saw. He smiled modestly and deprecatingly when I gave him the Bishop of Peterborough's message. "He won't accept the blessing of a heretic bishop, but tell him that he has my prayers, and ask him to give me his." "Does he call himself a heretic bishop?" he asked doubtfully, and I had to explain that the bishop had probably used the term playfully. One day he told me about his early history. He was born on the 3rd of January, 1841, near Louvain in Belgium. On his 19th birthday his father took him to see his brother, who was then preparing for the priesthood, and he left him there to dine, while he himself went on to the neighbouring town. Young Joseph, this was his baptismal name, decided that there was the opportunity for taking the step which he had long been desiring to take, and when his father came back he told him that he wished to return home no more, and that it would be better thus to miss the pain of farewells. His father consented unwillingly, but, as he was obliged to hurry to the conveyance which was to take him home, there was no time for demur, and they parted at the station. Afterward, when all was settled, Joseph revisited his home and received his mother's approval and blessing. His brother was bent on going to the South Seas for mission work, and all was arranged accordingly, but at the last he was laid low with fever, and, to his bitter disappointment, forbidden to go. The impetuous Joseph asked if it would be a consolation to his brother if he were to go instead, and receiving an affirmative answer, he wrote surreptitiously, offering himself, and begging that he might be sent, though his education was not yet finished. The students were not allowed to send out letters till they had been submitted to the superior, but Joseph ventured to disobey. One day, as he sat at his studies, the superior came in and said with a tender reproach, "Oh, you impatient boy, you have written this letter, and you are to go." Joseph jumped up and ran out, and leaped about like a young colt. "Is he crazy?" said the other students. He worked for some years on other islands in the Pacific, but it happened that he was one day in 1873 present at the dedication of a chapel in the island of Maui, when the bishop was lamenting that it was impossible for him to send a missioner to the lepers at Molokai, and still less to provide them with a pastor. He had only been able to send them occasional and temporary help. Some young priests had just arrived in Hawaii for mission work, and Father Damien instantly spoke. "Monseigneur," said he, "here are your new missioners. One of them could take my district, and if you will be kind enough to allow it, I will go to Molokai and labour for the poor lepers, whose wretched state of bodily and spiritual misfortune has often made my heart bleed within me." His offer was accepted, and that very day, without any farewells, he embarked on a boat that was taking some cattle to the leper settlement. When he first put his foot on the island, he said to himself, Now, Joseph, my boy, this is your life work." I did not find one person in the Sandwich Islands who had the least doubt as to leprosy being contagious, though it is possible to be exposed to the disease for years without contracting it. Father Damien told me that he had always expected that he should sooner or later become a leper, though exactly how he caught it he does not know. But it was not likely that he would escape, as he was constantly living in a polluted atmosphere, dressing the sufferers' sores, washing their bodies, visiting their deathbeds, and even digging their graves. In his own words is a report of the state of things in Molokai 16 years ago, and I think a portion will be interesting. "By special providence of our divine Lord, who during his public life showed us particular sympathy for the lepers, my way was traced toward Kalawao in May 1873. I was then 33 years of age, enjoying a robust good health. About 80 of the lepers were in the hospital. The others, with a very few kokuas (helpers), had taken their abode farther up toward the valley. They had cut down the old pandanus groves to build their houses, though a great many had nothing but branches of castor oil trees with which to construct their small shelters. These frail frames were covered with the ki leaves, or with sugar-cane leaves, the best ones with pili grass. I, myself, was sheltered during several weeks under a single pandanus tree, which is preserved up to the present in the churchyard. Under such primitive roofs were living without distinction of age or sex, old or new cases, all more or less strangers one to another, those unfortunate outcasts of society. They passed their time with playing cards, hula (native dances), drinking fermented ki-root beer, homemade alcohol, and with the sequels of all this. Their clothes were far from being clean and decent, on account of the scarcity of water, which had to be brought at that time from a great distance. Many a time in fulfilling my priestly duty at their domiciles, I have been compelled to run outside to breathe fresh air. To counteract the bad smell I made myself accustomed to the use of tobacco, whereupon the smell of the pipe preserved me somewhat from carrying in my clothes the noxious odour of the lepers. At that time the progress of the disease was fearful, and the rate of mortality very high. The miserable condition of the settlement gave it the name of a living graveyard, which name, I am happy to state, is to-day no longer applicable to our place." In 1874 a Kona south wind blew down most of the lepers' wretched, rotten abodes, and the poor sufferers lay shivering in the wind and rain, with clothes and blankets wet through. In a few days the grass beneath their sleeping mats began to emit a very unpleasant vapour. "I at once," says Father Damien, "called the attention of our sympathizing agent to the fact, and very soon there arrived several schooner loads of scantling to build solid frames with, and all lepers in distress received, on application, the necessary material for the erection of decent houses. Friends sent them rough boards and shingles and flooring. Some of the lepers had a little money, and hired carpenters. For those without means, the priest, with his leper boys, did the work of erecting a good many small houses. I remember well that when I arrived here," again says Father Damien, "the poor people were without any medicines, with the exception of a few physics and their own native remedies. It was a common sight to see people going round with fearful ulcers, which, for the want of a few rags, or a piece of lint and a little salve, were left exposed. Not only were their sores neglected, but any one getting a fever, or any of the numerous ailments that lepers are heir to, was carried off for want of some simple medicine. Previous to my arrival here it was acknowledged and spoken of in the public papers, as well as in private letters, that the greatest want in Kalawao was a spiritual leader. It was owing in a great measure to this want that vice as a general rule existed instead of virtue, and degradation of the lowest type went ahead as a leader of the community. When once the disease prostrated them, women and children were often cast out, and had to find some other shelter. Sometimes they were laid behind a stone wall and left there to die, and at other times a hired hand would carry them to the hospital. As there were so many dying people, my priestly duty toward them often gave me the opportunity to visit them at their domiciles, and although my exhortations were especially addressed to the prostrated, often they would fall upon the ears of public sinners, who little by little became conscious of the consequences of their wicked lives, and began to reform, and thus, with the hope in a merciful Saviour, gave up their bad habits. Kindness to all, charity to the needy, a sympathizing hand to the sufferers and the dying, in conjunction with a solid religious instruction to my listeners, have been my constant means to introduce moral habits among the lepers. I am happy to say that, assisted by the local administration, my labours here, which seemed to be almost in vain at the beginning, have, thanks to a kind Providence, been greatly crowned with success. The water supply of Molokai was a pleasant subject with Father Damien. When he first arrived, the lepers could only obtain water by carrying it from the gulch on their poor shoulders. They had also to take their clothes to some distance when they required washing, and it was no wonder that they lived in a very dirty state. He was much exercised about the matter, and one day, to his great joy, was told that at the end of the valley called Waihanau there was a natural reservoir. He set out with 2 white men and some of his boys, and travelled up the valley till he came with delight to a nearly circular basin of most delicious ice-cold water. Its diameter was 72 feet by 55, and not far from the bank they found, on sounding, that it was 18 feet deep. There it lay, at the foot of a high cliff, and he was informed by the natives that there had never been a drought in which this basin had dried up. He did not rest till a supply of water pipes had been sent them, which he and all the able lepers went to work and laid. Henceforth clear sweet water has been available for all who desire to drink, to wash, or to bathe. It was after living at the leper settlement for about 10 years that Father Damien began to suspect that he was a leper. The doctors assured him that this was not the case, but he once scalded himself in his foot, and to his horror he felt no pain. Anesthesia had begun, and soon other fatal signs appeared. One day he asked Dr. Arning, the great German doctor who was then resident in Molokai, to examine him carefully. "I cannot bear to tell you," said Dr. Arning, "but what you say is true." "It is no shock to me," said Damien, "for I have felt sure of it." I may mention here that there are 3 kinds of leprosy. Father Damien suffered, as is often the case, both from the anaesthetic and the tubercular forms of the disease. "Whenever I preach to my people," he said, "I do not say 'my brethren,' as you do, but 'we lepers.' People pity me and think me unfortunate, but I think myself the happiest of missionaries." Henceforth he came under the law of segregation, and journeys to the other parts of the islands were forbidden, but he worked on with the same sturdy, cheerful fortitude, accepting the will of God with gladness, undaunted by the continual reminders of his coming fate, which met him in the poor creatures around him. "I would not be cured," he said to me, "if the price of my cure was that I must leave the island and give up my work." A lady wrote to him, "You have given up all earthly things to serve God here and to help others, and I believe you must have now joy that nothing can take from you, and a great reward hereafter." "Tell her," he said with a quiet smile, "that it is true. I do have that joy now." He seldom talked of himself, except in answer to questions, and he had always about him the simplicity of a great man, clothed with humility. My last letter from him is dated Kalawao, 28th February, 1889. "My dear Edward Clifford, your sympathizing letter of the 24th gives me some relief in my rather distressed condition. I try my best to carry, without much complaining and in a practical way, for my poor soul's sanctification, the long foreseen miseries of the disease, which, after all, is a providential agent to detach the heart from all earthly affection, and prompts much the desire of a Christian soul to be united, the sooner the better, with Him who is her only life. During your long travelling road homeward, please do not forget the narrow road. We both have to walk carefully, so as to meet together at the home of our common and eternal Father. My kind regards and prayers and good wishes for all sympathizing friends. Bon voyage, mon cher ami, et au revoir au ciel. Votus tuus. J. Damien. About 3 weeks after writing this letter, he felt sure that his end was near, and on the 28th of March he took to his bed. "You see my hands," he said. "All the wounds are healing, and the crust is becoming black. You know that is a sign of death. Look at my eyes, too. I have seen so many lepers die that I cannot be mistaken. Death is not far off. I should have liked to see the bishop again, but le bon Dieu is calling me to keep Easter with himself. God be blessed. How good he is to have preserved me long enough to have 2 priests by my side at my last moments, and also to have the good sisters of charity at the leproserie. That has been my nunc dimittis. The work of the lepers is assured, and I am no longer necessary, and so will go up yonder. Father Vendelene said, 'When you are up above, Father, you will not forget those you leave orphans behind you.' Oh no, if I have any credit with God, I will intercede for all in the leproserie. And will you, like Elijah, leave me your mantle, my father, in order that I may have your great heart?" "Why, what would you do with it?" said the dying martyr. "It is full of leprosy." He rallied for a little while after this, and his watchers even had a little hope that his days might be lengthened. Father Conradi, Father Vendelene, and Brother Joseph were much in his company. Brother James was his constant nurse. The sisters from Kalaupapa visited him often, and it is good to think that the sweet, placid face and the gentle voice of the mother were near him in his last days. Everybody admired his wonderful patience. He who had been so ardent, so strong, and so playful, was now powerless on his couch. He lay on the ground on a wretched mattress like the poorest leper. They had the greatest difficulty in getting him to accept a bed. And how poorly off he was, he who had spent so much money to relieve the lepers, and so forgotten himself that he had none of the comforts and scarcely the necessaries of life. Sometimes he suffered intensely. Sometimes he was partly unconscious. He said that he was continually conscious of 2 persons being present with him. One was at the head of the bed and one at his feet, but who they were he did not say. The terrible disease had concentrated itself in his mouth and throat. As he lay there in his tiny domicile, with the roar of the sea getting fainter to his poor diseased ears, and the kind face of Brother James becoming gradually indistinct before his failing eyes, did the thought come to him that after all his work was poor, and his life half a failure. Many whom he had hoped much of had disappointed him. Not much praise had reached him. The tide of affection and sympathy from England had cheered him, but England was so far off that it seemed almost like sympathy and affection from a star. Churches were built, schools and hospitals were in working order, but there was still much to be done. He was only 49, and he was dying. Well, God's will be done. He knows best. My work, with all its faults and failures, is in His hands, and before Easter I shall see my Saviour. The breathing grew more laboured, the leprous eyes were clouded, the once stalwart frame was fast becoming rigid. The sound of the passing bell was heard, and the wail of the wretched lepers pierced the air. The last flickering breath was breathed, and the soul of Joseph Damien de Voister arose like a lark to God. End of section 24. End of Heroes Every Child Should Know by Hamilton Wright Mabie.